Welcome, true believers, to one of Marvel's most epic and emotionally devastating tales. Tonight, we journey through the complete saga of Planet Hulk and World War Hulk, a story that spans galaxies and explores the deepest themes of betrayal, survival, love, and vengeance. This is the tale of how Bruce Banner's greatest allies became his greatest enemies, how exile led to kingship, and how love transformed into rage that nearly shattered the world. So settle in, get comfortable, and let your mind drift as we explore this cosmic odyssey of pain and power. There's no rush here, just let the story wash over you like the cosmic winds of distant Sakaar. In the shadows of power, in rooms that officially do not exist, decisions are made that reshape the fate of worlds. The Illuminati did not choose their name for its mystery or grandeur, but for its promise of enlightenment through knowledge that others could not bear to possess. They were Earth's secret guardians, 6 of the most brilliant and powerful individuals ever to walk among humanity, bound together by the terrible responsibility of making choices that no single person should ever have to make alone. Tony Stark brought to their clandestine meetings the cold logic of an engineer's mind wrapped in the troubled conscience of a man who had seen his own inventions used to destroy. His arc reactor glowed softly in the dim light of their hidden chamber, a constant reminder that even the most beneficial technologies could become weapons in the wrong hands. He understood better than most that sometimes the greatest mercy was the cruelest decision, that saving the many might require sacrificing the few. Reed Richards sat across from him, his brilliant mind already calculating probabilities and outcomes that stretched decades into the future. Where others saw moral complexity, Reed saw mathematical certainties. His elastic body remained perfectly still as his thoughts stretched across dimensional barriers and temporal possibilities, exploring every potential ramification of the choice they were contemplating. The weight of infinite intelligence pressed down upon him like the gravitational pull of a collapsing star. Dr. Stephen Strange's presence seemed to warp the very air around him, reality bending slightly at the edges where his mystical awareness touched the mundane world. The Sorcerer Supreme saw threats that existed beyond the physical realm, cosmic entities and dimensional horrors that regarded Earth as little more than an interesting bauble to be conquered or consumed. His insights into the supernatural aspects of Bruce Banner's condition painted a picture that was even more terrifying than the purely scientific assessments. Black Bolt's silence filled the room more completely than any spoken words could have. The Inhuman King's slightest whisper could shatter mountains, his softest sigh could level cities, and so he communicated through stillness and subtle gestures that spoke volumes to those who knew how to read them. His presence at these meetings represented not just his own people's interests, but the perspective of those who understood what it meant to possess power too great for normal human interaction. Professor Charles Xavier should have been among them, his telepathic abilities providing insights into human nature that could have guided their decision toward greater compassion and understanding. But Xavier was absent from this crucial gathering, dealing with crises among his own students that demanded his immediate attention. His empty chair seemed to reproach them all, a reminder that they were making decisions about the fundamental nature of humanity without the counsel of the man who understood human minds better than anyone. Namor the Submariner completed their circle, his dual nature as both human and Atlantean giving him a unique perspective on the challenges of existing between worlds. His experiences ruling an undersea kingdom while maintaining ties to the surface world made him acutely aware of the diplomatic complexities involved in managing threats that transcended traditional boundaries. Yet his royal imperious nature also made him perhaps the most willing among them to take decisive action, regardless of individual cost. The subject of their clandestine deliberation was absent, of course. Bruce Banner would never have agreed to attend a meeting dedicated to discussing his fate, and the Hulk would have torn their secret chamber apart the moment he realized what they were planning. This absence was both a practical necessity and a moral failing that weighed heavily on each of their consciences. They were making decisions about a man's life without giving him the opportunity to defend himself or offer alternatives. The evidence they had assembled painted a picture of escalating danger that none of them could ignore. Las Vegas still bore the scars of the Hulk's last major rampage, entire city blocks reduced to rubble by a creature whose anger knew no bounds and whose strength seemed to grow with each passing year. The casualty reports made for grim reading, families destroyed not by malice but by the uncontrollable fury of a man who had never asked for the burden he carried. Reed's holographic displays showed probability matrices that extended into the future, tracking the potential consequences of leaving the Hulk on Earth versus the risks of the action they were contemplating. Every variable he could quantify pointed toward the same conclusion. Bruce Banner was a weapon of mass destruction wrapped in the tortured psyche of a genuinely good man, and sooner or later, the weapon would overcome the man's attempts to control it. Tony's analysis focused on the technological aspects of the threat. The Hulk's strength appeared to have no upper limit, scaling with his emotional state in ways that defied conventional physics. Worse, Bruce Banner's scientific intellect remained partially accessible even in his transformed state, making him not just incredibly strong, but dangerously clever. The combination of unlimited physical power and genius-level intelligence represented a threat that no conventional defense could hope to contain. Strange's mystical investigations had revealed even more disturbing possibilities. The gamma radiation that had created the Hulk was not merely a scientific accident but had resonated with cosmic forces that existed beyond human understanding. There were entities in other dimensions that viewed the Hulk as a potential weapon or ally, and the longer he remained on Earth, the greater the risk that his power might be corrupted or exploited by beings whose intentions were utterly inimical to human survival. The debate that followed was conducted in hushed tones, each man weighing his words carefully as they grappled with the moral implications of their proposed solution. They were not talking about imprisonment or therapy, or any of the conventional approaches to dealing with dangerous individuals. They were discussing exile, the removal of a human being from his home world against his will, based on crimes he might commit in the future, rather than anything he had actually done. Tony argued that they had a responsibility to protect the innocent, that Bruce Banner himself would want them to take action if he truly understood the full scope of the threat he represented. He pointed to Banner's own attempts at suicide, his desperate efforts to rid the world of the Hulk through his own death, as evidence that Bruce himself recognized the danger and would approve of less extreme measures if they proved effective. Reed countered with calculations showing that exile might actually be the kindest solution, both for Bruce and for the world. On a planet with no intelligent life, the Hulk could rage freely without causing harm to anyone, while Bruce Banner could find the peace and isolation he had always sought. It was an elegant solution that solved multiple problems simultaneously while avoiding the moral complications of imprisonment or execution. Strange raised concerns about the mystical implications of their plan. Removing the Hulk from Earth might weaken the planet's defenses against supernatural threats, as Bruce Banner had often served as an unwilling but effective guardian against cosmic-level menaces. However, he also acknowledged that the risks of leaving him in place were beginning to outweigh the benefits of having such a powerful defender available. Black Bolt's silence was perhaps the most eloquent argument of all. As a man who lived every day with the knowledge that his voice could kill anyone he cared about, he understood better than any of them what it meant to be a prisoner of your own power. His eventual nod of agreement carried the weight of hard-won wisdom about the sometimes necessary sacrifices that ultimate power demanded. Namor's support came with characteristic directness. As a ruler, he had made difficult decisions about the greater good throughout his long reign, and he saw no fundamental difference between exiling a dangerous individual from Atlantis and removing a threat from Earth. His royal perspective simplified the moral complexities into a straightforward question of protecting one's subjects from harm. The plan they developed was as elegant as it was deceptive. They would approach Bruce Banner not as judges pronouncing sentence, but as friends offering hope. The world they had selected was everything they would tell him it was. Lush, beautiful, uninhabited by intelligent life, a place where the Hulk could exist without fear of harming innocents, and where Bruce Banner could find the peace that had always eluded him on Earth. The shuttle they provided was equipped with the most advanced technology available, comfortable accommodations for the journey, and a comprehensive database of information about his new home. They told themselves that they were giving him a gift, an opportunity to start over in a place where his condition would be a blessing rather than a curse. The recording they prepared for him to watch during the journey was crafted with genuine affection and carefully worded explanations of their reasoning. Reed Richards took responsibility for the technical aspects of the deception, his scientific reputation providing credibility that Bruce would find difficult to question. The gravitational calculations were accurate, the stellar cartography was precise, and the projected travel time was exactly what they told him it would be. Everything about the mission was truthful except for the most important detail of all, the destination itself. The world they actually sent him to was not the peaceful paradise they described. Their intelligence was flawed, their surveys incomplete, their understanding of the cosmic forces involved tragically inadequate. The wormhole that was supposed to deliver him safely to his new home was unstable, prone to fluctuations that could alter course in ways that their models had failed to predict. They thought they were sending him to sanctuary, but they were actually launching him toward a nightmare. Tony Stark's technology included safeguards and monitoring systems that were designed to ensure Bruce's safety during the journey and provide them with confirmation of his safe arrival. The communications array would allow them to maintain contact if necessary, and the ship's navigation systems included backup options in case of emergency. They told themselves that they were being responsible guardians, making sure their friend reached his destination safely. Strange's mystical protections were woven into the very fabric of the ship, spells designed to shield Bruce from supernatural threats during his passage through the void between worlds. The Sorcerer Supreme understood better than his colleagues that space was not empty, but filled with entities and energies that could be hostile to human life. His enchantments were supposed to ensure that Bruce would arrive at his destination unchanged and unharmed. The launch itself was conducted in secret, away from prying eyes that might question their actions or alert Bruce to the true nature of his situation. They told him they were sending him to a better life, and in their hearts, they believed it was true. The shuttle lifted off into the star-filled sky, carrying not just Bruce Banner but their hopes for a solution that would protect both him and the world he was leaving behind. As the ship disappeared into the cosmic darkness, each member of the Illuminati carried with him a different mixture of relief and guilt. They had acted according to their best judgment, using all of their considerable resources and intelligence to craft what they believed was the optimal solution to an impossible problem. They were Earth's secret protectors, and they had protected Earth in the only way that seemed possible. But good intentions, no matter how pure, do not guarantee good outcomes. The universe has its own plans, and the forces they had set in motion would soon spiral far beyond their control or comprehension. Their act of mercy would become an act of betrayal, their gift would become a curse, and their attempt to save both Bruce Banner and the world would ultimately endanger everything they held dear. The recording they had prepared for Bruce to watch during his journey was filled with genuine remorse and careful explanations of their reasoning. Reed's voice carried the weight of scientific certainty as he outlined the logical necessity of their decision. Tony's words conveyed the pain of a friend who had been forced to make an impossible choice. Strange's mystical insights provided context for threats that extended beyond the purely physical realm. They told him that they were sorry, that they had agonized over this decision, that they still considered him a hero and a friend despite the action they were taking. They explained that there had been times when his anger had been used to save the world, protecting humanity from threats that no other force could have defeated. But they also reminded him that just as many times, that same anger had put the world in danger, threatening innocent lives through no fault of his own, but simply because his power was too great for any single individual to control safely. The planet they described to him was everything they genuinely believed they were sending him to, a lush world covered in vegetation and game, with no intelligent life forms to threaten or be threatened by. It was a place where he could finally be alone, where he could find the peace that had always been denied to him on Earth. They painted it as a paradise, custom-made for someone with his unique needs and circumstances. But as Bruce Banner watched their carefully prepared message, his rage began to build. The realization that his closest allies had conspired behind his back to exile him from his home world struck him like a physical blow. These were the people he had trusted, the heroes he had fought alongside, the friends who had claimed to understand and accept him despite his condition. Their betrayal cut deeper than any enemy's attack ever could. The ship's interior bore the brunt of his transformation as the Hulk emerged in the confined space of the shuttle. Sophisticated control systems were reduced to sparking wreckage, navigation computers were smashed beyond repair, and the carefully plotted course was altered by the violence of his rage. What had been planned as a precise journey to a specific destination became a chaotic tumble through space toward whatever world happened to lie in their path. The damage to the ship's systems was catastrophic, but not immediately fatal. The hull remained intact, life support continued to function, and the basic propulsion systems were still operational despite the destruction of their guidance mechanisms. But the carefully calculated trajectory that was supposed to deliver him to a peaceful world was gone, replaced by a course determined by the random physics of his destructive fury. As the damaged shuttle tumbled through the void, its unconscious passenger had no way of knowing that his rage had sealed his fate in ways that his supposed friends never could have imagined. The world that now lay ahead of him was not the paradise they had promised, but a nightmare realm where violence was a way of life and survival depended on the very qualities that had made him too dangerous for Earth. The Illuminati, monitoring the ship's progress from their secret chamber, watched with growing alarm as their carefully laid plans disintegrated along with the shuttle's navigation systems. They had intended to give Bruce Banner a gift, but their betrayal had transformed that gift into something else entirely. Their act of mercy was about to become the catalyst for events that would shake the foundations of reality itself. The damaged shuttle tumbled through the cosmic void for what felt like an eternity, its hull scarred by the violence of its passengers' rage and its navigation systems reduced to sparking wreckage. Bruce Banner had fallen unconscious after his transformation, his body reverting to human form as the adrenaline and fury that had fueled the Hulk's emergence finally subsided. He drifted in the zero gravity of the cabin, surrounded by the debris of sophisticated technology that had been reduced to twisted metal and shattered displays by his uncontrolled anger. When consciousness finally returned to him, it came with the nauseating realization that something had gone terribly wrong. The shuttle was no longer following the smooth, predictable trajectory that Reed Richards had programmed into its computers. Instead, it was spinning end over end through space, pulled by gravitational forces that had never been part of the original flight plan. Through the cracked viewport, Bruce could see an alien sun growing larger with each passing hour, its light tinged with colors that no star in Earth's sky had ever displayed. The planet that loomed ahead of him was nothing like the peaceful world that the Illuminati had described in their carefully prepared recording. Even from the growing distance, Bruce could see that this was a world at war with itself. Massive geological upheavals scarred its surface, and the aurora that danced around its magnetic poles spoke of radiation levels that would have been lethal to most forms of life. This was not the garden paradise they had promised him, but something far more dangerous and unpredictable. Sakaar hung in space like a wounded giant, its surface a patchwork of different biomes that seemed to shift and change as tectonic forces reshaped the landscape on a scale that dwarfed anything Earth had ever experienced. The planet's red sun cast everything in a bloody light that made even the most peaceful valleys look ominous and threatening. Massive storm systems swirled across continents, and the scars of ancient impact craters suggested that this world had been bombarded by cosmic debris for millions of years. The atmosphere was thick with volcanic ash and radioactive particles, creating spectacular auroras that painted the sky in shades of green and violet. But Bruce's scientific mind recognized these displays for what they really were: evidence of a world where the very air was saturated with energies that would have killed most humans within hours of exposure. Only someone with his unique physiology could hope to survive in such an environment, and even then, survival was far from guaranteed. The shuttle's atmospheric entry was violent and uncontrolled, the damaged heat shields struggling to protect their occupant as the craft plowed through layers of superheated gas and particulate matter. The cabin filled with smoke and the smell of burning electronics as systems failed one by one under the stress of re-entry. Bruce felt the Hulk stirring within him as his body responded to the immediate threat, but he fought to maintain control, knowing that a transformation now would likely doom them both. The impact when it finally came was catastrophic but survivable. The shuttle carved a deep furrow through what appeared to be a desert landscape before finally coming to rest against a formation of crystalline rocks that absorbed the worst of the kinetic energy. Bruce was thrown around the cabin like a rag doll, accumulating bruises and cuts that would have been serious injuries for anyone without his enhanced healing factor. As the dust settled and the emergency systems fell silent, he found himself stranded on an alien world with no way to return home, and no clear understanding of what he might face. The first sign that this world was inhabited came in the form of chittering sounds from outside the wrecked shuttle. Bruce peered cautiously through the damaged viewport and saw creatures that defied easy classification. They moved on multiple legs like insects, but displayed intelligence and coordination that suggested they were more than mere animals. Their bodies were covered in natural armor that gleamed dully in the alien sunlight, and their movements had the predatory grace of born hunters. These were the Hive, one of the many species that had evolved on Sakaar's harsh surface. They communicated through pheromone trails and ultrasonic calls that created a complex language of scent and sound. As social insects, they operated with a collective intelligence that made individual members seem almost interchangeable, but their hive mind was capable of strategic thinking that rivaled any human military organization. Bruce watched with growing unease as more of the creatures emerged from hidden burrows in the crystalline formations. They surrounded the crash site with methodical precision, their movements coordinated by signals he couldn't detect or understand. These were not the simple animals he might have hoped to encounter on an uninhabited world, but clearly intelligent beings with their own agenda and territorial instincts. The attack, when it came, was swift and overwhelming. The hive creatures swarmed over the shuttle like a living tide, their natural weapons scraping against the metal hull as they searched for ways to penetrate its defenses. Bruce felt his heart rate accelerate as the familiar sensation of impending transformation began to build in his chest. He tried to fight it, tried to maintain the calm that Dr. Leonard Sampson had taught him in their therapy sessions, but the immediate threat to his survival made rational thought increasingly difficult. The Hulk emerged with a roar that echoed across the alien landscape, his green form tearing through the shuttle's weakened hull as easily as paper. The hive creatures recoiled momentarily from this unexpected development, their compound eyes reflecting their surprise at finding such a formidable opponent inside what had appeared to be a standard escape pod. But their surprise quickly gave way to tactical adaptation as they adjusted their attack patterns to account for this new threat. The battle that followed was brief but intense. The Hulk's strength was more than adequate to deal with individual hive warriors, but their numbers and coordination made them dangerous opponents even for someone of his power level. They attacked in waves, using their fallen comrades as stepping stones to reach vulnerable points on his massive frame. Their natural weapons were sharp enough to pierce even his enhanced skin, drawing green blood that seemed to drive them into an even greater frenzy. But the Hulk's rage was building with each wound they inflicted, and his strength was growing correspondingly. What had begun as a defensive action quickly transformed into a massacre as he tore through their ranks with increasing fury. The crystalline formations around the crash site were shattered by the force of his blows, and the desert sand was stained with the bodily fluids of creatures that had never before encountered anything like the green giant who had fallen from the sky. The survivors of the hive assault retreated with the same coordination they had displayed in their attack, carrying their wounded with them as they disappeared into burrows that seemed to extend deep beneath the planet's surface. The Hulk stood amid the carnage of his first battle on Sakaar, his chest heaving with exertion and rage as he surveyed the alien landscape that stretched endlessly in all directions. It was then that he felt the sharp pain in the back of his neck, a sensation so unexpected that it penetrated even his battle fury. He reached up to investigate and found a small device embedded in his flesh, its metal surface warm to the touch and pulsing with some kind of internal energy. Before he could react further, paralysis began to spread through his massive frame, and his vision started to blur as the device's effects overwhelmed even his enhanced physiology. The voice that spoke to him as consciousness faded was cultured and amused, tinged with the casual arrogance of someone accustomed to absolute authority. Based on your comically moronic expression, it would appear that the translation implants have finally reached your brain. The speaker was tall and lean, his skin bearing the greyish pallor common to Sakaar's ruling class. His clothing marked him as a person of importance, and the energy weapon in his hand suggested that resistance would be both futile and painful. This was Governor Cray, administrator of the Wukar province and representative of the Red King's will in this remote corner of the Empire. He had been monitoring the crash site since the shuttle's dramatic entry into Sakaar's atmosphere, and the arrival of such an obviously powerful specimen represented an opportunity too valuable to ignore. The gladiatorial arenas of Crown City were always in need of fresh talent, and something that could single-handedly defeat an entire hive hunting party would be worth a fortune in the betting pools. The paralysis device, known locally as an obedience disc, was a marvel of Sakaarian biotechnology that interfaced directly with its victim's nervous system. Once implanted, it made resistance not just difficult but agonizing, delivering precisely calibrated jolts of pain whenever the subject failed to comply with direct orders. The technology had been refined over centuries of use on the planet's various subject populations, and even the strongest warriors eventually learned to submit to its influence. As the Hulk collapsed under the device's effects, his massive form reverting to the more manageable size of Bruce Banner, Governor Cray stepped closer to examine his prize. The Green Giant's transformation had been unexpected, but the man who remained was clearly of alien origin, possibly human if the records of ancient visitors were to be believed. His unusual physiology and obvious combat skills would make him a valuable addition to the gladiatorial stables, assuming he could be properly trained and controlled. The governor pulled out an ornate scroll and began to read in the formal tones required by imperial law. He declared that by the authority vested in him by the Red King and by the ancient customs of the Sakaarian Empire, this alien creature was now imperial property. His ship, such as it was, would be seized for examination by the royal engineers, and he himself would be transported to the gladiatorial schools for evaluation and training. Bruce struggled to respond to this pronouncement, his scientific mind rebelling against the casual assumption that he was somehow less than human simply because he had arrived from off-world. But the paralysis device made coherent speech impossible, and his words came out as little more than incoherent growling. The governor seemed amused by his attempts at communication, interpreting them as evidence of a primitive intelligence that would require considerable modification before it could be made useful. The first order given to the newly enslaved Bruce Banner was simple and direct: kneel. It was a test of the obedience disc's effectiveness as much as an assertion of authority, designed to establish the proper relationship between master and slave that would govern all future interactions. The device responded to his defiant refusal with a jolt of pain so intense that it overrode even his enhanced nervous system, dropping him to his knees in the alien sand. The governor nodded with satisfaction at this display of the technology's effectiveness. The green transformation had been impressive, but it was clear that the creature's alternate form was equally susceptible to the disc's influence. This would make training much simpler than it might otherwise have been, since there would be no need to develop separate control protocols for each personality or physical configuration. The transport to the slave markets was accomplished with the same casual efficiency that characterized all aspects of Sicarian society. Bruce was loaded onto an anti-gravity platform along with other recent acquisitions, his paralyzed form secured with restraints that seemed designed more for psychological effect than actual security. The obedience disc made physical restraints largely unnecessary, but the visible symbols of bondage served to reinforce the prisoner's new status in ways that purely technological control could not achieve. The journey to the nearest trading post took them across landscapes that would have been breathtaking under other circumstances. Sakar's surface was a study in violent contrasts, with crystalline desert giving way to volcanic plains that in turn yielded to forests of metallic trees that chimed softly in the radioactive wind. The planet's geological instability meant that these biomes were constantly shifting and changing, creating an ever-evolving tapestry of environments that defied easy categorization. Bruce's scientific training allowed him to recognize some of what he was seeing despite his current circumstances. The metallic trees were clearly some form of silicon-based life that had evolved to incorporate heavy metals into their cellular structure, probably as protection against the intense radiation that bathed this world. The volcanic activity suggested a molten core that was far more active than Earth's, possibly destabilized by gravitational forces from multiple moons or nearby stellar bodies. The slave market itself was a testament to the casual brutality that characterized Sicarian society. Beings from dozens of different worlds were displayed like merchandise, their various physiologies and abilities catalogued for potential buyers who moved through the crowds with the detached interest of livestock evaluators. The diversity of species represented spoke to Sakar's position as a crossroads between dimensional barriers, a place where refugees and criminals from across the galaxy eventually found themselves. The auctioneer who handled Bruce's sale was a professional who had been evaluating alien physiology for decades. He could tell at a glance that this specimen was something unusual, possibly valuable enough to attract bidders from the gladiatorial schools rather than the agricultural collectives that usually purchase the more mundane acquisitions. The green transformation that several witnesses had reported suggested enhanced combat capabilities that would be wasted on manual labor. The bidding started at 15 silver pieces, a respectable opening for an unknown quantity from an uncharted world. But as word of the newcomer's unusual abilities spread through the crowd, the price began to climb rapidly. Representatives from several major gladiatorial houses were present, and each recognized the potential value of a warrior who could apparently transform at will between different physical configurations. The winning bid of 60 silver pieces came from an agent representing one of Crown City's most prestigious training facilities. The Moor was known throughout the Empire for producing champions who could survive in the great arena long enough to win their freedom, and their trainer had developed an eye for recognizing potential in even the most unlikely specimens. This green alien might prove to be another profitable investment in their stable of warriors. Bruce felt a surge of rage as the auctioneer's gavel fell, finalizing his sale to the highest bidder, like a piece of equipment rather than a sentient being. The casual dehumanization was more infuriating than the physical constraints, or even the pain of the obedience disc. These people treated slavery as a normal part of their society, reducing conscious beings to economic units in a market economy built on suffering and exploitation. The transport to the gladiatorial training facility was accomplished in a windowless container that prevented the newest acquisitions from seeing their destination or planning potential escape routes. Bruce found himself sharing the confined space with beings whose physiologies ranged from the merely unusual to the completely alien. Some appeared to be recent arrivals like himself, still showing signs of the shock and disorientation that came with sudden enslavement, while others had the dulled expressions of those who had already accepted their fate. The facility known as the Moor was built into the side of an active volcano, its training areas carved directly from the living rock and heated by geothermal vents that created an atmosphere of perpetual sweltering intensity. The architecture was designed to be both functional and intimidating, with massive stone blocks that could withstand the most violent training exercises while simultaneously reminding the inhabitants that escape was impossible. The Moor's trainer was a figure known simply as Primus, a scarred veteran of the gladiatorial circuit who had earned his position through decades of survival in the arena, followed by an equally impressive record of developing new talent. He evaluated each new arrival with the dispassionate eye of someone who had seen thousands of potential warriors pass through his facility, most of whom had died within their first few contests. When Bruce's container was opened and he stumbled out into the volcanic heat of the training facility, Primus took one look at his alien physiology and nodded with professional interest. Humans were rare on Sakaar, but not unheard of, and their combination of intelligence and adaptability often made them valuable additions to a gladiatorial stable. The reports of this one's transformation abilities made him potentially very valuable indeed, assuming he could be properly trained and motivated. The other new arrivals represented a cross-section of Sakaar's diverse population of involuntary immigrants. There was a Cronan rock creature whose people were known throughout the galaxy as noble warriors, though this particular specimen seemed unusually philosophical for his species. A member of the insectoid race known as the Unhived stood apart from the others, his individual consciousness, a rarity among beings who typically functioned as part of a collective intelligence. A female brood warrior carried herself with the predatory grace common to her species, though something in her manner suggested a tragic history that had separated her from her people. The Shadow Priest bore the ritual scars of his order, marking him as someone who had fallen from grace in ways that were probably too complex for outsiders to fully understand. The young woman who appeared to be of Sakaarian nobility was perhaps the most intriguing addition, since slaves from the ruling class were typically executed rather than sold. Primus addressed the group with the casual authority of someone accustomed to absolute obedience from his charges. He explained that they were now residents of the Empire's most lethal gladiatorial training facility, where they would learn to fight or die in the attempt. The Moor's reputation was built on producing warriors who could survive in the great arena long enough to earn their freedom, but that freedom came at a cost measured in blood and suffering. The training regimen began immediately, with no allowance made for exhaustion or adjustment to their new circumstances. Combat skills were developed through constant practice against increasingly dangerous opponents, while physical conditioning was maintained through exercises designed to push even enhanced physiologies to their breaking points. The volcanic environment itself served as an additional challenge, forcing the trainees to adapt to extreme heat and toxic atmospheric conditions. Bruce's first sparring sessions revealed the extent of his unusual abilities to both his trainers and his fellow inmates. His transformation into the Hulk was triggered by the intense physical stress of combat training, and his enhanced strength quickly established him as one of the facility's most formidable residents. But the obedience disc ensured that this power remained under the control of his captors, turning his greatest asset into another form of bondage. The psychological effects of enslavement were in many ways more devastating than the physical hardships. Bruce had always struggled with feelings of powerlessness and loss of control, and the obedience disc represented the ultimate expression of both. His scientific mind understood exactly how the device worked, interfacing with his nervous system in ways that made resistance not just futile but agonizing. Yet this knowledge only made the experience more psychologically damaging. The other trainees dealt with their circumstances in different ways, each finding their own methods of preserving some sense of identity and purpose despite their bondage. The Cronan warrior maintained his people's code of honor even in slavery, while the unhived struggled with the isolation of individual consciousness. The brood warrior channeled her species' natural aggression into her training, and the shadow priest found solace in meditation and ritual observance. The young Sicarian woman proved to be the most politically aware of their group, understanding the broader implications of the Red King's rule in ways that the off-worlders could not fully appreciate. Her presence among the slaves was itself a political statement, evidence of the growing instability within the empire that might eventually create opportunities for those clever enough to exploit them. As weeks passed in the volcanic heat of the moor, the disparate group of trainees began to develop the bonds of shared hardship that would eventually grow into something stronger. They were all victims of the same system, aliens in their own ways despite some being native to this world, and their survival depended on learning to work together despite their different backgrounds and physiologies. The training itself was designed not just to develop combat skills, but to break down individual identity and rebuild it in service to the gladiatorial system. Slaves who thought of themselves primarily as warriors were easier to control than those who maintained strong connections to their previous lives and loyalties. The process was gradual but relentless, wearing away at personal identity until only the drive to survive remained. But Bruce Banner's scientific background gave him insights into the psychological manipulation being attempted, and his previous experience with trauma and loss had taught him methods of psychological resistance that his captors had not anticipated. The Hulk might be controlled by the obedience disc, but Bruce Banner's mind remained his own, and he began to share strategies for maintaining mental independence with his fellow trainees. The gladiatorial system of Sakaar was built on more than just entertainment value, though the crowds in the great arena certainly provided a substantial economic incentive for maintaining the institution. It also served important social and political functions, providing an outlet for the aggressive impulses of the population, while simultaneously demonstrating the power and authority of the ruling class. Slaves who could win their freedom through combat prowess provided an illusion of social mobility that helped maintain stability among the subject populations. The great arena itself was a marvel of Sicarian engineering, carved from a single massive asteroid that had impacted the planet millennia earlier. Its seating could accommodate hundreds of thousands of spectators, while its combat floor incorporated technological marvels that could create virtually any type of environment or challenge. The arena's designers had understood that variety was essential for maintaining audience interest, so they had equipped their facility with systems that could simulate everything from underwater battles to zero-gravity combat. As Bruce's training progressed and his skills developed, it became increasingly clear that he and his fellow trainees were being prepared for something more significant than routine gladiatorial contests. The intensity of their preparation, the quality of equipment they were being trained with, and the presence of high-ranking observers at their practice sessions all suggested that they were destined for the great arena itself, where only the most promising warriors were allowed to compete. The transformation of Bruce Banner from captured alien to trained gladiator was nearly complete, but the man beneath the conditioning remained unchanged in the ways that mattered most. His rage at the injustice of his situation continued to fuel the Hulk's power, while his scientific mind continued to analyze his surroundings for weaknesses that might eventually be exploited. The stage was being set for events that would shake the foundations of the Sicarian Empire, though none of the participants yet realized the true scope of what was about to unfold. The volcanic training grounds of the Moor stretched deep into the bowels of Sicar's restless geology, where molten rock flowed in rivers of liquid fire and the air itself seemed to pulse with deadly heat. Here, in chambers carved from obsidian and cooled magma, the newest additions to the gladiatorial system would learn whether they possessed the strength, skill, and ruthless determination necessary to survive in the great arena. The facility's reputation was built on a simple truth. Those who emerged from its crucible were warriors worthy of the name, while those who failed became footnotes in the Empire's endless appetite for blood and spectacle. Bruce Banner stood with his fellow trainees on the edge of what their captors called the Moor proper, a vast pit where lava bubbled and churned in patterns that seemed almost alive. The heat was so intense that it would have killed most humans within minutes. But the obedience discs implanted in each slave's nervous system provided minimal life support functions along with their primary purpose of ensuring absolute obedience. The technology was a marvel of Sicarian bioengineering, interfacing directly with its victims' physiologies to maintain them at peak performance while simultaneously making rebellion impossible. Primus stood before them with the casual authority of someone who had witnessed thousands of similar gatherings over his years as the Moor's chief trainer. His scarred face bore testament to his own survival in the arena, and his eyes held the cold assessment of a professional evaluating livestock. Each new group brought its own challenges and possibilities, but this particular collection of aliens and outcasts showed more promise than most. The green-skinned human's transformation abilities alone made him potentially valuable, while the others displayed combat instincts that suggested they might survive long enough to generate significant profits in the betting pools. The first lesson was simple and brutal. Survival in the Moor required absolute cooperation with their captors' demands. The obedience discs made physical resistance futile, delivering precisely calibrated jolts of neural disruption whenever their wearers failed to comply with direct orders. But more than that, survival required learning to work within a system that treated them as expendable resources rather than sentient beings. Those who could not adapt to this reality would die, usually during their first few training sessions. The Cronan warrior who had been given the designation Korg stood nearly 8 feet tall, his rocky hide scarred by countless battles fought in defense of his homeworld, before its destruction had left him one of the few survivors of his species. His people had been renowned throughout the galaxy for their honor and martial prowess, qualities that had made them formidable opponents but poor slaves. Most Cronans died rather than submit to bondage, but Korg had chosen survival for reasons that he kept to himself, at least initially. His philosophy was evident in everything he did, from the way he carried himself despite the obedience disc's restrictions to his interactions with the other trainees. Korg had seen enough of war and death to understand that honor sometimes required compromise, and that preserving one's essential nature was more important than maintaining pride in circumstances where pride was a luxury none of them could afford. His calm presence became a stabilizing influence on the group, providing a moral center around which the others could organize their own responses to their situation. The insectoid designated Meek represented one of the most tragic cases in their small group. His species, the Hive, operated through collective consciousness, with individual identity subsumed into the greater good of the community. But Meek had been separated from his people during one of the Red King's purges, leaving him with an individual consciousness that his biology was never designed to support. The result was a creature caught between two forms of existence, neither fully individual nor truly part of a collective, struggling to find meaning in a life that defied his species' basic nature. His forearms moved with precise coordination despite his psychological struggles, and his compound eyes saw details that escaped his mammalian companions. Meek's insectoid physiology gave him natural weapons and enhanced reflexes that made him formidable in combat, but his greatest asset was his intelligence. Cut off from the hive mind, he had been forced to develop individual problem-solving skills that were rare among his people, making him both a valuable ally and a dangerous opponent depending on circumstances. The female brood warrior, who refused to give any name beyond her species designation, carried herself with the predatory grace that characterized her people throughout the galaxy. The brood were parasitic creatures who reproduced by implanting their eggs in other species, creating offspring that retained the host's appearance while possessing brood instincts and capabilities. But this particular specimen seemed to have been separated from her people under circumstances that had left her without the typical brood drive to spread their species through the galaxy. Her sleek form was perfectly designed for combat, with natural weapons that could penetrate most forms of armor and reflexes that operated faster than most nervous systems could process. But there was something in her manner that suggested profound loss, an emptiness that went beyond simple separation from her kind. The other trainees learned to read her moods carefully, understanding that her grief could transform into lethal violence with little warning, while her loyalty once earned was absolute and unwavering. The figure known as Heroim bore the ritual scars and tattoos that marked him as a priest of the Shadow People, one of Sakar's most ancient and respected religious orders. His fall from grace had been precipitous and complete, transforming him from a respected spiritual leader into a branded criminal whose very presence was considered an affront to proper society. The specifics of his disgrace were never fully explained, but the depth of shame in his eyes suggested that he bore responsibility for failures that had cost lives. His training in the shadow arts had given him abilities that transcended purely physical combat, allowing him to manipulate energy fields and phase partially out of normal space-time. These skills made him uniquely dangerous in battle, but his greatest strength was his understanding of Sakarian society and politics. Heroim knew which officials could be bribed, which guards could be trusted, and which seemingly impossible situations might actually offer hidden opportunities for those clever enough to recognize them. The young woman who had been given the designation Elo seemed almost out of place among the hardened warriors and alien creatures that made up their training group. Her noble bearing and educated speech patterns marked her as someone who had been raised in privilege, possibly even within the imperial court itself. But her presence in the Maw indicated that she had fallen from favor in ways that were probably both dramatic and permanent. Her combat skills were less developed than those of her companions, but she possessed something equally valuable: detailed knowledge of the political currents that shaped the empire. Elo understood the factions within the nobility, the economic pressures that drove imperial policy, and the social tensions that were slowly building toward what might eventually become open rebellion. Her insights into the minds and motivations of their captors would prove invaluable as their group began to plan for futures that extended beyond simple survival. The bonds that began to form between these disparate individuals were forged in the crucible of shared hardship and mutual dependence. Each training session brought new challenges designed to test not just their individual capabilities, but their ability to function as a coordinated unit. The gladiatorial system preferred teams to individual fighters, understanding that group dynamics created more complex and entertaining contests that could sustain audience interest over longer periods. Bruce found himself gradually accepting his role as the group's de facto leader, a position that fell to him not through any conscious decision, but simply because his unique abilities made him the most likely to survive the extreme challenges they faced. The Hulk's strength was unmatched by any of his companions, while Bruce Banner's scientific training gave him analytical capabilities that complemented their various forms of practical wisdom and combat experience. The training regimen itself was designed to break down individual identity and rebuild it in service to the gladiatorial system, Each day brought exercises that pushed their physiologies to the breaking point, followed by combat scenarios that required them to fight for their lives against opponents who showed no mercy. The psychological pressure was constant and unrelenting, designed to wear away at their connections to their previous lives until only the drive to survive remained. But the group that was slowly coalescing around Bruce's leadership proved more resistant to this conditioning than their captors had anticipated. Each member brought their own methods of psychological survival, and they began to share these techniques with each other in quiet moments between training sessions. Korg's philosophical approach to suffering provided a framework for understanding their situation without being consumed by it, while Hiroim's spiritual practices offered ways to maintain inner strength despite external powerlessness. The combat training took place in environments that simulated the various challenges they might face in the great arena. Lava pits tested their ability to fight while avoiding environmental hazards, while zero-gravity chambers prepared them for battles that might take place in the void between worlds. Underwater scenarios trained them to function when deprived of normal sensory input, and toxic atmosphere simulations taught them to fight while wearing breathing apparatus that limited their mobility and awareness. Each session revealed new aspects of their individual capabilities, while also highlighting areas where they needed to improve. Bruce's transformations into the Hulk were triggered by the extreme stress of combat, but he was learning to maintain some degree of conscious control, even in his altered state. This development was both encouraging and terrifying, as it suggested possibilities for resistance that their captors had not anticipated when they implanted his obedience disc. Korg's rocky hide made him nearly invulnerable to most forms of physical attack, but his size and strength came at the cost of mobility and speed. He was learning to use these limitations as advantages, positioning himself as an immovable anchor around which his more agile teammates could maneuver. His philosophical nature also made him the group's natural mediator, resolving conflicts before they could escalate into violence that might attract unwanted attention from their guards. Meek's insectoid physiology gave him natural advantages in speed and reflexes, but his separation from the hive mind had left him uncertain about how to apply his abilities effectively. The individual decision-making that came naturally to his mammalian companions was still foreign to his instincts, requiring constant conscious effort to override biological programming. But as he learned to think independently, his tactical insights became increasingly valuable to the group's survival strategies. The Nameless Brood's combat instincts were perhaps the most refined of any member of their group, honed by millions of years of evolutionary pressure that had shaped her species into perfect predators. But her greatest challenge was learning to suppress those same instincts when stealth or diplomacy might serve their purposes better than violence. Her loyalty to the group was absolute once given, but earning that loyalty required proving worthiness according to standards that her companions could barely understand. Hiroim's fall from grace had cost him most of his priestly powers, but he retained enough of his shadow abilities to serve as the group's scout and infiltrator. His knowledge of Sicarian society allowed him to navigate the complex social hierarchies of the training facility, identifying potential allies and threats among both the staff and their fellow slaves. His shame over past failures drove him to seek redemption through service to his new companions, creating a loyalty that was both powerful and potentially dangerous. Elo's noble background made her the most politically aware member of their group, but it also made her the most psychologically fragile. The transition from privilege to slavery was particularly traumatic for someone who had been raised to expect deference and respect from those around her. But her knowledge of imperial politics and her understanding of the social pressures that were building throughout the empire would prove invaluable as their plans began to extend beyond simple survival. The rituals that bound them together as a group evolved organically from their shared experiences and mutual dependence. There was no formal ceremony or conscious decision to become a team, but rather a gradual recognition that their survival depended on maintaining absolute loyalty to each other, regardless of external pressures. They began to think of themselves not as individuals who happened to be imprisoned together, but as a unit whose members were interchangeable parts of a larger whole. The concept of warbound emerged from Korg's philosophical framework, but it was embraced by all of them as a way of understanding their relationship that transcended the temporary circumstances of their enslavement. To be warbound meant accepting responsibility for each other's survival and well-being, even when such responsibility might conflict with personal safety or individual desires. It was a bond that could only be broken by death, and even then only if that death served the greater good of the surviving members. Bruce's acceptance of this bond represented a significant psychological shift for someone who had spent most of his adult life trying to avoid close personal relationships. The Hulk's power had always made him dangerous to those around him, creating isolation that was both self-imposed and externally enforced. But the unique circumstances of their imprisonment had created a situation where his dangerous nature was actually an asset to the group's survival, allowing him to form connections that had been impossible in his previous life. The training scenarios became increasingly complex as their skills developed and their teamwork improved. Simple combat exercises gave way to elaborate simulations that required them to navigate political intrigue, resource scarcity, and moral dilemmas that had no clear solutions. Their captors were not just preparing them for physical combat in the arena, but for the psychological challenges that would determine whether they could survive long enough to become profitable investments. The weapons training introduced them to the vast arsenal of combat equipment that was available in the great arena, from simple swords and clubs to exotic energy weapons that could alter the fundamental properties of matter. Each weapon required different techniques and strategies, but more importantly, each created different opportunities for teamwork and coordination. Learning to fight as a unit rather than as individuals was perhaps the most important skill they developed during their time in the Maw. The psychological profiling that accompanied their physical training was designed to identify weaknesses that could be exploited for the entertainment of arena audiences. Spectators enjoyed seeing warriors struggle with internal conflicts as much as they appreciated displays of physical prowess. So the gladiatorial system invested considerable effort in understanding the emotional vulnerabilities of their fighters. This analysis would determine not just what opponents they faced, but what scenarios would create the maximum dramatic tension for the crowds. Bruce's sessions with the facility's psychological evaluators were particularly intensive, as his dual nature presented both unique opportunities and unprecedented challenges for their purposes. The relationship between Bruce Banner and the Hulk was unlike anything their specialists had encountered, requiring new approaches to both analysis and control. The obedience disc could compel transformation, but understanding what triggered natural changes in his condition was crucial for maximizing the entertainment value of his performances. The other members of their group underwent similar analysis, though their cases were generally more straightforward than Bruce's complex psychology. Korg's honor-based value system made him predictable in many ways, while Meek's separation from his collective consciousness created vulnerabilities that could be exploited through isolation and sensory deprivation. The Brood's grief over her lost people was an obvious pressure point, while Hiroim's shame over his fall from grace could be manipulated through references to his past failures. Elo's psychological profile was perhaps the most complex after Bruce's, as her noble upbringing had left her with expectations and assumptions that were completely incompatible with her current circumstances. Her struggle to adapt to powerlessness was both a source of weakness that could be exploited and a potential source of strength if she could learn to channel her frustration constructively. As their training progressed and their skills developed, it became increasingly clear that they were being prepared for something more significant than routine gladiatorial contests. The quality of their instruction, the sophistication of the scenarios they faced, and the presence of high-ranking observers at their practice sessions all suggested that they were destined for the great arena itself, where only the most promising warriors were allowed to compete. The great arena was the crown jewel of the Sicarian entertainment industry, a massive structure that could accommodate hundreds of thousands of spectators while providing them with contests that pushed the boundaries of what was possible in terms of both spectacle and drama. The facility's advanced technology could create virtually any environment or challenge, while its gladiators represented the finest warriors that could be found throughout the galaxy. Earning the right to compete in the great arena was both an honor and a death sentence for most gladiators. The rewards for success were substantial, including the possibility of earning freedom and citizenship within the Empire, but the challenges were correspondingly extreme. Most warriors who entered the great arena never left it, dying in contests that were designed to push them beyond their limits in pursuit of the ultimate entertainment experience for the crowds. The bonds between the members of their group continued to strengthen as they faced increasingly difficult challenges together. Each successful mission or training exercise reinforced their trust in each other's abilities and commitment, while each failure taught them valuable lessons about their individual limitations and the importance of teamwork. They were becoming more than just a collection of individuals who happened to be imprisoned together. They were becoming a true unit whose members could anticipate each other's actions and compensate for each other's weaknesses. The rituals that marked their growing unity were simple but meaningful, drawn from the various cultural traditions that each member brought to the group. Korg's people had ceremonies for acknowledging brotherhood among warriors, while Hiroim's shadow traditions included rites for binding souls together in common purpose. Even Meek's insectoid nature included instinctual behaviors that could be adapted to express loyalty and commitment to the group. Bruce found himself learning from each of his companions in ways that enriched his understanding of what it meant to be part of something larger than himself. Korg's philosophical approach to suffering taught him that strength could be found in acceptance as well as resistance, while Meek's struggle with individual consciousness showed him that identity was not fixed but could be consciously shaped through effort and decision. The Brood's absolute loyalty demonstrated the power of emotional commitment, while Hiroim's quest for redemption illustrated the possibility of finding purpose even in the aftermath of failure. Elo's political insights opened his eyes to the broader implications of their situation, helping him understand that their personal struggles were part of larger social and economic forces that shaped the entire empire. Her knowledge of the nobility's factional disputes and the economic pressures that drove imperial policy provided context that transformed their fight for survival into something with potentially greater significance. The weapons and combat techniques they mastered during their training would serve them well in the challenges that lay ahead, but their greatest asset was the unbreakable bond that had formed between them. They had become warbound in the truest sense of the word, united by shared hardship and mutual dependence into something that was stronger than the sum of its individual parts. This unity would be tested in ways that none of them could yet imagine, but the foundation had been laid for loyalty that would endure even unto death. As their preparation neared completion and their assignment to the great arena approached, each member of the group understood that they were about to face challenges that would determine not just their individual fates but the future of their bond as war-bound companions. The skills they had developed and the relationships they had forged would soon be tested in the most unforgiving arena that the Sicarian Empire could provide, where failure meant death and success offered only the promise of even greater challenges to come. The transformation of 6 disparate individuals into a unified team of warriors had been accomplished through shared suffering and mutual dependence, but it would be validated through the crucible of actual combat. They had learned to trust each other with their lives, but now they would discover whether that trust was justified and whether their bond was strong enough to survive the ultimate test of the great arena itself. The great arena of Crown City rose from the volcanic plains like a monument to organized violence, its massive stone walls scarred by centuries of combat that had entertained the masses while serving the political needs of Sakar's ruling class. Within its depths, the newest group of gladiators had earned their place through displays of skill and teamwork that had impressed even the most jaded observers. But the transition from training facility to actual arena combat brought with it pressures and expectations that would test every bond they had forged during their time in the Maw. The rule that governed advancement in the gladiatorial system was deceptively simple. 3 victories in the great arena would earn a team their freedom and citizenship within the Empire. This promise had motivated countless warriors over the centuries, driving them to extraordinary feats of courage and skill in pursuit of liberty that always seemed tantalizingly close yet impossibly distant. The reality was more complex than the simple rule suggested, as the definition of victory could be manipulated by those in power to serve their own purposes rather than the interests of the fighters themselves. Bruce and his war-bound companions had achieved their first victory against opponents who had been specifically chosen to test their coordination and individual capabilities. The crowd had responded with enthusiasm to their performance, particularly the Green Warrior's dramatic transformation and the tactical brilliance displayed by his teammates. But success in the arena was measured not just by survival, but by entertainment value, and their captors were already planning challenges that would push them toward even more spectacular displays of violence and heroism. The second victory had come against a group of mechanical opponents designed to simulate the technological threats that the Empire faced from various advanced civilizations throughout the galaxy. These constructs possessed no consciousness or capacity for suffering, which had initially made the battle seem less morally complex than fighting against other enslaved beings. But the mechanical warriors had been programmed with tactical subroutines that made them formidable opponents, requiring the warbound to develop new strategies and push their abilities to previously unexplored limits. The third victory was supposed to represent the culmination of their journey through the gladiatorial system, the final challenge that would earn them their promised freedom and the right to live as citizens rather than slaves. The crowd had gathered in unprecedented numbers to witness what the arena's promoters had advertised as a contest of legendary proportions, featuring opponents worthy of warriors who had proven themselves capable of surviving and thriving in the Empire's most dangerous entertainment venue. But as the gates opened to reveal their final challenge, it became clear that the Red King had no intention of honoring his promises. Instead of the traditional opponents they had been led to expect, the arena floor was occupied by a single figure whose presence transformed the entire nature of their situation. Elo Kafi stood in chains at the center of the combat area, her noble bearing unchanged despite months of imprisonment and the obvious signs of torture that marked her body. The warbound stood in stunned silence as they realized the true nature of the choice they were being forced to make. This was not a combat scenario designed to test their skills or provide entertainment for the crowd, but a deliberate attempt to destroy the bonds that had sustained them through their darkest hours. They were being commanded to kill one of their own, to sacrifice the trust and loyalty that had made them stronger than the sum of their individual parts. The Red King's voice echoed across the arena as he explained the terms of this final test. Elo had been convicted of treason against the Empire, her noble birth and political connections making her a particularly dangerous example of resistance that needed to be eliminated in the most public and dramatic way possible. The warbound could earn their freedom by executing her themselves, demonstrating their complete loyalty to the system that had enslaved them, or they could refuse and face the consequences of defying imperial authority. Bruce felt the familiar surge of rage building within him as he comprehended the full scope of the trap that had been laid for them. This was not about testing their combat abilities or even their loyalty to the Empire, but about breaking their spirits by forcing them to betray everything they had come to value during their time together. The Red King understood that warriors could be controlled through fear and pain, but that the bonds between them represented a form of resistance that could not be tolerated. Korg's reaction was immediate and uncompromising. His people's code of honor made it impossible for him to participate in the execution of an innocent companion, regardless of the consequences for his own survival. The philosophical framework that had sustained him through the worst aspects of their enslavement drew clear distinctions between acceptable and unacceptable actions, and murdering Elo clearly fell into the latter category. Meek's insectoid nature had originally made him uncomfortable with the concept of individual loyalty that his mammalian companions valued so highly, but his months of separation from the hive mind had taught him to appreciate the connections that could exist between discrete consciousnesses. Elo had been part of the group that had helped him navigate the transition from collective to individual existence, and abandoning her now would represent a betrayal of everything he had learned about the value of personal relationships. The nameless brood warrior's response was perhaps the most visceral, as her species' absolute loyalty to their chosen pack made the concept of betraying a companion literally unthinkable. Her predatory instincts were already shifting from the arena's intended target to the guards and officials who had orchestrated this scenario, calculating angles of attack and evaluating the feasibility of turning this execution into a wholesale slaughter of their captors. Hiroim's fall from grace within the Shadow Priesthood had been precipitated by his refusal to compromise his moral principles in service to political expediency, and he recognized the parallel between his past situation and their current dilemma. The shame he carried over his previous failures made him even more determined to act with honor now, regardless of the personal cost that such action might entail. The crowd's reaction to the unfolding drama was a mixture of anticipation and bloodlust that revealed the depths to which Sicarian society had fallen under the Red King's rule. These people had gathered to witness what they believed would be a simple execution disguised as gladiatorial combat, but they were beginning to sense that they might instead be seeing the beginning of something far more significant and dangerous to the established order. The obedience discs implanted in each warrior's nervous system began to pulse with increasing intensity as the Red King's patience with their hesitation diminished. The technology was designed to compel absolute compliance with direct orders, delivering pain that increased exponentially with continued resistance until the subject's will was completely broken. But the bonds between the warbound had created psychological resilience that their captors had not anticipated, allowing them to endure suffering that would have crushed individual fighters. Primus, the scarred trainer who had overseen their development from raw recruits into seasoned warriors, stepped forward with the control device that could activate all of their obedience discs simultaneously. His expression was unreadable as he prepared to force compliance through technological coercion, but there was something in his manner that suggested internal conflict over the role he was being asked to play in this scenario. The moment of activation was agony beyond description, as neural pathways throughout their bodies were flooded with precisely calibrated pain designed to override conscious thought and reduce them to simple compliance with their captors' demands. But instead of breaking under the torture, the warbound drew strength from their shared suffering, using their bonds to each other as anchors that prevented the pain from overwhelming their individual identities. Bruce felt the Hulk stirring within him as the obedience disc's influence battled with his natural rage response. The technological control was sophisticated, but it had been designed to manage normal physiological reactions rather than the unique conditions created by his gamma-induced mutation. The interaction between the disc's neural interference and the Hulk's emerging consciousness created feedback loops that threatened to damage both the technology and his nervous system. Hiroim was the first to find his voice despite the pain that racked his body, his training in the shadow arts providing techniques for maintaining consciousness even under extreme duress. His words carried the weight of ancient traditions and moral authority that transcended the immediate circumstances of their enslavement, invoking codes of honor that predated the Red King's rule and would outlast his eventual downfall. The invocation of the war-bound provisions of the Shadow Pact sent shockwaves through the crowd and the arena's officials, as it represented a legal and spiritual challenge to imperial authority that could not be easily dismissed. The ancient laws that governed relationships between warriors contained protections for those who had sworn loyalty to each other, recognizing that such bonds were essential for maintaining military effectiveness and social stability. The Red King's response was swift and brutal, demonstrating the contempt he held for traditions that might limit his absolute authority. But his attempt to override ancient law through modern tyranny only served to highlight the illegitimacy of his rule and the growing disconnect between imperial power and the cultural foundations that had once sustained Sicarian civilization. The breaking of the obedience discs was both a technological failure and a spiritual victory, as the Warbound's collective will prove stronger than the Empire's most sophisticated methods of control. The devices had been designed to function indefinitely under normal conditions, but the unique combination of physiologies, the intensity of their emotional bonds, and the righteous nature of their resistance created conditions that overwhelmed the technology's operational parameters. The Silver Surfer's sudden appearance in the arena represented another layer of complexity in an already chaotic situation. His cosmic-level powers made him potentially the most dangerous opponent any gladiator could face, but his obvious reluctance to participate in the proceedings suggested that he, like them, was being coerced rather than acting of his own free will. The obedience disc that controlled him was a more advanced version of their own, designed to compel compliance from beings whose natural abilities far exceeded normal biological limitations. The battle that followed was unlike anything the Great Arena had ever witnessed, as cosmic forces clashed with terrestrial fury in a display that pushed the facility's protective systems to their breaking points. The Silver Surfer's power cosmic created energy discharges that threatened to damage the arena's structure, while the Hulk's increasing rage generated seismic effects that could be felt throughout Crown City. But the true turning point came not from displays of raw power, but from the Warbound's decision to prioritize the Surfer's freedom over their own tactical advantage. Heroim's leap toward the control systems that regulated the cosmic being's obedience disc demonstrated that their commitment to justice extended beyond their own immediate circle, encompassing all those who suffered under tyrannical oppression. The crowd's reaction to this development was mixed, as some spectators began to understand that they were witnessing something more significant than a simple gladiatorial contest. The Warbound were not just fighting for their own survival, but challenging the fundamental assumptions upon which their society was built. The implications of their actions extended far beyond the arena's walls, threatening to inspire similar acts of resistance throughout the Empire. The Red King's fury at this turn of events was palpable, his carefully orchestrated scenario having transformed into a public relations disaster that undermined his authority and exposed the weakness of his control systems. The failure of the obedience discs was not just a technical malfunction, but a symbol of resistance that could inspire others to question the technological foundations of imperial power. The liberation of the arena's other enslaved fighters was a logical extension of the Warbound's actions, as their success had demonstrated that resistance was possible, even under seemingly impossible circumstances. The slaves who had been forced to witness the proceedings as a lesson in the futility of rebellion suddenly found themselves presented with an example of successful defiance that offered hope for their own futures. The battle for control of the great arena became a microcosm of the larger struggle between tyranny and freedom that was brewing throughout Sicarian society. The Warbound's actions had catalyzed forces that had been building for years, providing a focal point for resistance that transformed individual discontent into collective action. Elo's role in these events extended beyond her position as a victim to be rescued, as her knowledge of imperial politics and her connections to various resistance movements made her a valuable asset in the broader struggle against the Red King's rule. Her survival and liberation represented not just a moral victory for the warbound, but a strategic advantage that could be leveraged in future campaigns. The escape from the arena required not just combat prowess but tactical brilliance, as the warbound found themselves facing not only the facility's security systems but also the broader Imperial forces that were beginning to mobilize in response to the crisis. Their success depended on their ability to maintain the unity and coordination that had carried them through their gladiatorial trials, while adapting to the chaos of urban warfare. The transformation of the warbound from gladiators into revolutionary leaders was neither planned nor desired, but it represented the inevitable consequence of their refusal to compromise their principles in the face of tyrannical demands. Their actions in the arena had made them symbols of resistance whether they wanted that role or not, and their survival depended on their ability to fulfill the expectations that their heroism had created. The broader implications of their escape extended far beyond their personal freedom, as their example inspired similar acts of resistance throughout the empire. Slave rebellions began to break out in multiple provinces, each drawing strength from the knowledge that successful defiance was possible even against the empire's most sophisticated control systems. The Red King's response to these developments was predictably violent, as he attempted to maintain control through increased brutality rather than addressing the underlying causes of popular discontent. But his heavy-handed tactics only served to further alienate his subjects and provide additional motivation for those who were already contemplating rebellion. The warbound's journey from the arena to whatever sanctuary they could find was complicated by their new status as the Empire's most wanted fugitives. Every step they took was monitored by surveillance systems. Every safe house they might use was known to Imperial intelligence, and every ally they might call upon was potentially compromised by the Empire's extensive network of informants and collaborators. But their greatest asset remained their bond to each other and the trust that had been forged through shared hardship and mutual dependence. The unity that had sustained them through their gladiatorial trials would now be tested in the even more challenging environment of guerrilla warfare against a totalitarian state that commanded resources they could barely comprehend. The stage was being set for a conflict that would determine not just their individual fates but the future of Sicarian civilization itself. The warbound had become symbols of hope for the oppressed and threats to the established order, roles that would define their actions and relationships for whatever time remained to them on this violent and unpredictable world. The escape from the Great Arena had transformed the warbound from enslaved gladiators into symbols of resistance, but symbols without substance were quickly crushed by the overwhelming power of the Imperial war machine. As they made their way through the labyrinthine passages beneath Crown City, guided by Elo's knowledge of the ancient tunnel systems that honeycombed the volcanic bedrock, each step carried them further from their old lives as entertainers and closer to their new roles as leaders of a revolution they had never intended to start. The refugees who began to gather around them came from every corner of Sicarian society, united not by shared culture or common ancestry, but by the simple fact that they had nothing left to lose. Former slaves who had escaped during the chaos of the arena breakout walked alongside impoverished citizens whose livelihoods had been destroyed by the Red King's increasingly erratic policies. Religious dissidents who had been marked for persecution marched with political prisoners who had survived the purges that had eliminated most organized opposition to imperial rule. Bruce found himself struggling to understand the transformation that had occurred within his own psyche during their months of enslavement and combat. The rage that had defined the Hulk for so many years was still present, but it had evolved from a purely destructive force into something that could be channeled toward constructive purposes. The bonds he had formed with his warbound companions had taught him that strength could be used to protect rather than simply to destroy, and that the power he had always feared could become a tool for justice rather than an instrument of chaos. The Shadow Elders who emerged from their hidden sanctuaries to pledge their support to the growing rebellion brought with them not just political legitimacy, but spiritual authority that transcended the immediate circumstances of their struggle. These ancient beings had served as guardians of Sicarian culture for millennia, preserving traditions and wisdom that predated the current imperial dynasty by thousands of years. Their recognition of Bruce as the prophesied Sicarian carried weight that went far beyond mere propaganda value. The prophecy itself was ancient and complex, speaking of a green warrior who would come from the stars to break the chains that bound Sakar's people and restore balance to a world that had been thrown into chaos by tyrants and false kings. Like most prophecies, it was subject to multiple interpretations, but the Shadow Elders saw in Bruce's unique combination of alien origin, transformative abilities, and moral leadership the fulfillment of promises that had sustained their people through centuries of oppression. Kayera, the Old Strong, emerged from the ranks of the Imperial Shadow Guard like a figure from legend, her decision to abandon her oath of loyalty to the Red King, representing a fundamental shift in the balance of power that governed Sicarian politics. As one of the last surviving members of an ancient bloodline that had once ruled these lands, her support lent legitimacy to the rebellion that no amount of military success could have provided. But more than that, her presence brought knowledge of imperial tactics and strategies that would prove invaluable in the campaigns to come. The old strong heritage that flowed through Kayera's veins connected her directly to Sakar itself, allowing her to sense the planet's geological moods and predict the seismic events that regularly reshaped its surface. This ability had made her people natural rulers in ancient times, as they could guide their subjects away from volcanic eruptions and earthquake zones that would have devastated other populations. The genetic modifications that gave her enhanced strength and endurance were secondary to this deeper connection to the world around her. Her first meeting with Bruce took place in the ruins of an ancient temple dedicated to the old gods who had supposedly ruled Sakar before the coming of technology and imperial bureaucracy. The volcanic glass walls of the structure still bore inscriptions in languages that predated current Sicarian script by millennia, their meanings preserved only in the memories of the shadow priesthood and the genetic records of bloodlines like hers. The attraction that sparked between them was immediate and powerful, transcending the obvious physical compatibility to encompass something deeper and more fundamental. Bruce recognized in Kayera someone who shared his burden of power and responsibility, while she saw in him the possibility of redemption for a world that had fallen far from the ideals its founders had envisioned. Their connection was both personal and political, representing the union of alien strength with native wisdom that the ancient prophecies had foretold. The campaign against the Red King's forces required a combination of conventional military tactics and guerrilla warfare techniques that pushed both Bruce's leadership abilities and his companions' combat skills to their limits. The Imperial Army was well equipped and professionally trained, with access to advanced technology and orbital support that gave them overwhelming advantages in any direct confrontation. But they were also spread thin across a planet where every province seemed to be experiencing some form of unrest, and their supply lines were vulnerable to the kind of hit-and-run attacks that the Warbound had perfected during their gladiatorial careers. The liberation of the Spike Fathers from their prison on Sakar's shattered moon represented both a humanitarian victory and a strategic masterstroke that fundamentally altered the nature of the conflict. These ancient beings had been imprisoned by the Red King not because they were dangerous to his rule, but because they represented a form of life that operated according to principles he could not understand or control. Their freedom transformed them from weapons of mass destruction into allies whose cosmic perspective provided insights that no purely terrestrial intelligence could match. The revelation of the Spike's true nature as cosmic entities who had become corrupted by isolation and despair spoke to deeper themes about the relationship between consciousness and environment that resonated with Bruce's own. experiences. Like him, they had been transformed by circumstances beyond their control into something that others feared and hated. But unlike him, they had been denied the possibility of connection and understanding that might have prevented their fall into madness. The spacefaring vessels that the Spike Fathers provided to the rebellion were marvels of biotechnology that operated according to principles that human science was only beginning to understand. Their hulls were grown rather than built. Their control systems interfaced directly with their pilots' nervous systems, and their propulsion methods drew energy from cosmic radiation that was invisible to conventional sensors. These ships gave the rebellion capabilities that the Imperial Navy had never encountered, allowing them to strike at targets that had previously been considered invulnerable. The siege of Crown City became the crucible in which the rebellion's ultimate victory or defeat would be decided. The imperial capital was protected by defensive systems that had been upgraded and strengthened over centuries, its walls incorporating both advanced technology and ancient sorcery in ways that created redundant layers of protection against any conceivable attack. But these same defenses had been designed to repel conventional assaults, not the kind of asymmetric warfare that the Warbound and their allies had perfected. The battle for the city's outer districts revealed the depth of support that the rebellion had gained among the civilian population, as ordinary citizens took up arms alongside the organized resistance forces. The Red King's brutal policies had alienated even those who had initially benefited from his rule, creating a situation where his own subjects were more dangerous to his regime than any external enemy could have been. The underground networks that honeycomb Crown City's foundations became highways for rebel forces who could appear anywhere within the capital without warning. Elo's knowledge of these passages, combined with intelligence provided by shadow priests who had maintained them for centuries, allowed the rebellion to coordinate attacks with precision that seemed impossible given their limited communications equipment. The psychological warfare campaign that accompanied the military assault was perhaps even more effective than the physical battles being fought in the streets above. The appearance of the prophesied Sarkasson leading an army of liberated slaves and alien allies struck at the mythological foundations of imperial legitimacy, suggesting that the Red King's rule had been rejected not just by his subjects but by the cosmic forces that governed the universe itself. The Red King's response to these challenges revealed the paranoia and instability that had always lurked beneath his facade of absolute confidence. His orders became increasingly erratic and self-defeating, as he struggled to maintain control over a situation that was spiraling beyond his ability to comprehend or manage. The loyalty of his own forces began to waver as they were commanded to commit atrocities that served no strategic purpose beyond satisfying their ruler's need for vengeance against a population that had dared to defy him. The final confrontation between Bruce and the Red King took place in the throne room of the Imperial Palace, a vast chamber carved from a single piece of volcanic obsidian that had been polished to mirror-like perfection. The walls were covered with murals depicting the achievements of previous emperors, their artistic grandeur serving as both inspiration and condemnation for a ruler whose reign had brought nothing but suffering and chaos to his people. The Red King's power armor was a masterpiece of Sicarian engineering, incorporating both advanced technology and mystical enhancements that multiplied his natural abilities to superhuman levels. The flames that wreathed his body were not merely decorative but represented the channeled essence of Sakar's volcanic core, giving him command over elemental forces that could reshape the landscape itself. He was no mere tyrant drunk on power, but a genuine threat whose abilities matched his megalomaniacal ambitions. The duel that followed was as much a battle of ideologies as it was a test of physical prowess. The Red King fought to preserve a system that elevated individual will above collective welfare, while Bruce battled for principles that recognized the inherent worth and dignity of every conscious being. Their conflict played out across multiple levels of reality, As the Hulk's rage-enhanced strength clashed with the Red King's mystically augmented power in a display that shook the foundations of the palace and sent shockwaves throughout the capital. The turning point came not from superior strength or advanced technology, but from the realization that the Red King's power was ultimately founded on fear and isolation, while Bruce's strength drew from connections and relationships that tyranny could never break. The warbound who fought alongside him, the rebels who had risked everything to follow his leadership, and even the planet itself, through its connection to Kyera, represented sources of power that no individual ruler could match or counter. The Red King's death marked the end of an era, but it also presented the rebellion with challenges that were in some ways more complex than those they had faced during their military campaign. Victory had been achieved, but the question of what kind of society would replace the fallen tyranny remained unanswered. The various factions that had united against their common enemy now had to find ways to work together in building something better than what they had destroyed. Bruce's coronation as the Green King of Sakaar took place in the same arena where he had once fought as a slave, transforming a symbol of oppression into a celebration of liberation and hope. The ceremony itself blended traditions from multiple cultures, acknowledging both the ancient heritage of the Sakaarian people and the contributions of the off-world allies who had helped secure their freedom. The crown that was placed upon his head was forged from metal, taken from the wreckage of the shuttle that had brought him to this world, symbolizing the transformation of exile into destiny. The early days of his reign were devoted to the massive task of reconstruction, both physical and social, that was required to heal a world that had been wounded by decades of misrule. The gladiatorial system was abolished, and its facilities converted into schools and hospitals, while the resources that had been devoted to maintaining the imperial military were redirected toward infrastructure projects that would benefit the entire population. The marriage ceremony that united Bruce with Kyera represented more than just a personal commitment between two individuals who had found love amid the chaos of war. It was a symbolic joining of alien and native, of strength and wisdom, of the transformative power that had freed Sakaar and the ancient heritage that would guide its future development. Their union was blessed by the Shadow Elders and witnessed by representatives from every province of the planet, creating bonds that transcended mere political alliance. The shadow binding ritual that sealed their marriage was conducted according to traditions that predated the imperial dynasty by millennia, connecting them not just to each other but to the planet itself and the cosmic forces that flowed through all living things. The ceremony required both participants to expose their deepest selves to their partner and to the spiritual forces that would govern their life together, creating a bond that could only be broken by death itself. Bruce's emergence as Bruce Banner during quiet moments of their relationship represented a level of peace and contentment that he had never experienced in his previous life. The Hulk remained present as a source of strength and protection, but for the first time since his transformation, Bruce was able to exist in his human form without the constant fear that his other self would emerge destructively. Kyera's presence provided an anchor that allowed him to maintain the psychological balance necessary for normal human relationships. The pregnancy that resulted from their union carried significance that extended far beyond the personal joy it brought to the royal couple. The child they were expecting would represent the future of Sakaar in the most literal sense, carrying within its genetic heritage both the transformative power that had liberated the planet and the ancient wisdom that would guide its continued development. The prospect of new life growing within the security and peace they had created together represented hope for a future that neither had dared to imagine during their darkest hours. The golden age that followed their marriage was brief but profound, representing everything that Sakaar could become under wise and compassionate leadership. The provinces that had been devastated by civil war began to recover and prosper, while new alliances were forged with neighboring worlds that had previously viewed Sakaar as a threat to galactic stability. Trade routes that had been disrupted by the Red King's aggressive policies were reopened, bringing prosperity to merchant classes that had suffered under the previous regime's autarkic economic policies. The legal reforms that Bruce instituted drew from his experiences as both victim and witness to the imperial justice system, creating courts that operated according to principles of evidence and due process rather than the arbitrary whims of hereditary rulers. The rights that were guaranteed to all citizens regardless of species or planet of origin represented a radical departure from traditional Sakarian law, but they were embraced by a population that had experienced the consequences of tyrannical rule firsthand. The educational initiatives that Kyera championed were designed to ensure that future generations would possess the knowledge and wisdom necessary to maintain the freedoms that had been won through so much sacrifice. Schools were established in even the remotest provinces, teaching not just practical skills, but also the history and philosophy that would help young Sakarians understand their place in the broader galaxy and their responsibilities to each other. The cultural renaissance that flourished under their rule saw the revival of art forms and traditions that had been suppressed during the imperial period, while also encouraging new expressions that reflected the transformed nature of Sakarian society. Musicians composed symphonies that incorporated the sounds of different worlds, while architects designed buildings that housed multiple species in comfort and harmony. The military reforms that were implemented under Bruce's guidance transformed the planet's defense forces from instruments of oppression into genuine protectors of peace and freedom. The gladiatorial combat techniques that had been developed for entertainment were adapted into training programs that prepared soldiers to defend their homes and families rather than conquest and domination. The diplomatic relationships that were established with other worlds represented a fundamental shift in Sakar's position within galactic politics, transforming it from a pariah state into a respected member of the interplanetary community. The refugees and former slaves who had found sanctuary on Sakar became ambassadors who carried news of the planet's transformation throughout the galaxy, inspiring similar movements for freedom and justice on other oppressed worlds. But even in the midst of this golden age, there were shadows and uncertainties that reminded all who cared to notice that peace was fragile and that the forces of tyranny were never completely defeated. The Spike Fathers' gratitude for their liberation was genuine and profound, but their alien nature made them incomprehensible allies whose true motivations remained mysterious. Their departure from Sakar's solar system was marked by ceremonies of farewell that acknowledged both the debt the planet owed them and the relief that came with their absence. The happiness that Bruce and Kyera found together was deeper and more complete than either had ever experienced, representing the fulfillment of dreams that had sustained them through their darkest hours. But happiness built on such foundations was precious precisely because it was fragile, dependent on circumstances that could change without warning and vulnerable to forces that no amount of strength or wisdom could completely control. The stage was being set for events that would test everything they had built together, challenging not just their personal relationship, but the entire civilization they had worked so hard to create. The seeds of tragedy were already present in their moment of greatest triumph, waiting only for the right conditions to sprout into disasters that no one could predict or prevent. The golden age of Sakar under King Hulk's reign had lasted longer than anyone had dared to hope, a period of peace and prosperity that had transformed a world scarred by centuries of tyranny into something approaching the paradise that the ancient prophecies had promised. The volcanic plains that had once been battlefields now bloomed with agriculture made possible by sophisticated irrigation systems, while the cities that had been fortresses became centers of learning and culture that attracted visitors from across the galaxy. But beneath this veneer of stability and progress, darker currents were beginning to flow, set in motion by choices made long ago and secrets that had been carefully hidden from those who had the most right to know them. Meek the Unhived had adapted to his role as one of the Green King's most trusted advisors with the same methodical precision that had characterized his survival in the gladiatorial arenas. His separation from the collective consciousness of his species had forced him to develop individual decision-making capabilities that were rare among his people, making him uniquely valuable as a counselor who could offer perspectives that his mammalian companions might overlook. But his insectoid nature also gave him access to information networks and communication channels that operated below the threshold of human awareness, allowing him to monitor developments that others might dismiss as unimportant. The intelligence that Meek had gathered during the final days of the campaign against the Red King was complex and disturbing, involving technical specifications and strategic assessments that he had chosen not to share with his war-bound companions during the chaos of the succession. The damaged shuttle that had brought the Green Scar to Sakaar had been more thoroughly examined by Imperial scientists than anyone had realized, and the results of that analysis had revealed details about its construction and payload that painted a very different picture of the circumstances surrounding Bruce's exile from Earth. The warp core that had powered the shuttle's faster-than-light propulsion system was not the standard model that would have been used for a simple exile mission, but a more advanced and potentially unstable variant that had been modified in ways that suggested deliberate sabotage rather than accidental malfunction. The energy signatures that Meek's contacts in the scientific community had detected were consistent with a device that had been designed to explode after a predetermined period, creating destruction that would eliminate any evidence of the modifications while also serving other purposes that were not immediately clear. The realization that the shuttle had been intended as a weapon rather than a vehicle for exile carried implications that struck at the very foundations of everything Bruce believed about his relationship with the heroes of Earth. The Illuminati had not simply made a difficult decision about an uncontrollable threat to planetary security, but had actively attempted to murder him while maintaining plausible deniability about their actions. The Green Warrior who had found love and purpose on Sakaar had been marked for death by the very people he had considered his closest friends and allies. Meek's struggle with this knowledge was both intellectual and emotional, as his loyalty to the Green King conflicted with his understanding of what this information might do to the fragile happiness that Bruce had finally achieved. The insectoid species had evolved to prioritize collective welfare over individual concerns, but his separation from the hive mind had taught him to value personal relationships in ways that his biology had never been designed to accommodate. The decision to reveal or conceal this devastating truth represented a moral dilemma that his people's genetic programming provided no guidance for resolving. The timing of this revelation was particularly cruel, as it came during a period when Bruce and Kyera's relationship had deepened into something that transcended mere political alliance or physical attraction. Their marriage had brought him a peace and contentment that had seemed impossible during his years of exile and rage on Earth, while their shared governance of Sakaar had proven that his strength could be channeled toward creation rather than destruction. The child that was growing within Kyera's womb represented the future that they were building together, a legacy that would embody both the transformative power that had liberated their world and the ancient wisdom that would guide its continued development. The scientific facilities that had been established in Crown City's rebuilt districts included laboratories where refugee scientists from across the galaxy worked on projects that combined their diverse knowledge bases in ways that were producing remarkable innovations. Among these researchers was a small group that specialized in analyzing wreckage and debris from spacecraft that had crashed on Sakaar over the centuries, their expertise making them invaluable for understanding the technological capabilities of the various civilizations that had sent representatives to this crossroads world. The holographic recording that had been salvaged from the shuttle's damaged memory banks was fragmentary and corrupted, but it contained enough information to reconstruct the basic outline of the message that Reed Richards and his colleagues had prepared for Bruce to watch during his journey. The expressions of regret and careful explanations of their reasoning seemed genuine, But the technical analysis of the shuttle's systems told a very different story about their true intentions and the measures they had taken to ensure that their solution to the Hulk problem would be permanent. Meek's decision to share this information with the Green King was motivated by his understanding that secrets and lies had been the foundation of the tyranny they had fought so hard to overthrow, and that any government built on deception would eventually fall victim to the same corruption that had destroyed the Red King's regime. But his loyalty to Bruce also demanded that he consider the personal cost of this revelation, weighing the abstract principle of truth-telling against the concrete harm that such knowledge might inflict on someone who had already suffered more betrayal than any individual should be expected to endure. The confrontation between Bruce and the holographic recording took place in the privacy of the royal chambers, where the stone walls that had witnessed the intimate moments of his relationship with Kyera now bore witness to the destruction of everything he had believed about his past. The familiar voices of Reed Richards, Tony Stark, and Stephen Strange echoed through the room as they explained their reasoning and expressed their regret. But their words were transformed by the knowledge of the warp core bomb into something far more sinister than the difficult but necessary decision they had claimed to be making. The rage that built within Bruce as he absorbed the full implications of what had been done to him was unlike anything he had experienced since his transformation into the Green King. This was not the hot fury of battle or the righteous anger of someone fighting for justice, but the cold hatred of someone who had been betrayed by those he trusted most. The Hulk's power had always been fueled by emotional intensity, but this new form of rage drew from psychological wounds that went deeper than physical pain or immediate threat. The physical manifestation of this fury was immediate and devastating, as the enhanced emotional state triggered transformations in the Hulk's physiology that pushed his strength and durability to levels that had never been recorded before. The stone walls of the chamber began to crack under the pressure of his presence, while the very air seemed to thicken with the intensity of the energies that were radiating from his transformed body. This was the birth of the World Breaker, a form of the Hulk that derived its power not from simple anger, but from the existential rage of someone whose entire worldview had been shattered by ultimate betrayal. The destruction that followed was both purposeful and symbolic, as Bruce systematically demolished every reminder of his previous life and his connections to the world that had rejected him so completely. The communications equipment that had maintained contact with Earth was reduced to scrap metal, while the scientific instruments that had been used to monitor cosmic conditions were scattered across the chamber floor like broken toys. The very technology that had enabled his exile became the target of a fury that sought to sever every remaining link to the civilization that had attempted to murder him. The sound of destruction drew Kyera to the chamber, her old strong heritage allowing her to sense the geological disturbances that were being generated by her husband's transformation. The sight that greeted her was terrifying in its implications, as she witnessed the emergence of a version of the Green King that she had never seen before, and that seemed to represent a fundamental change in his nature rather than a temporary loss of control. The conversation that followed was conducted across a chasm of pain and misunderstanding that neither of them had the tools to bridge. Bruce's rage was so complete that it left no room for the rational analysis that might have suggested alternative explanations or responses, while Kyera's efforts to provide comfort and perspective were overwhelmed by the sheer intensity of his emotional reaction. The love that had sustained them through every previous crisis was still present, but it was being tested by forces that neither of them had anticipated or prepared for. The decision to return to Earth was made in the white-hot fury of that initial revelation, driven by a need for vengeance that overrode every other consideration, including the welfare of the world they had worked so hard to build together. Bruce's transformation into the World Breaker had unlocked levels of power that made him capable of interstellar travel without technological assistance, but it had also stripped away the emotional controls that had allowed him to function as a leader and partner rather than simply as a force of destruction. The construction of the stone ship that would carry the surviving warbound to Earth represented both a technological marvel and a monument to the friendship that had sustained them through their darkest hours. The vessel was grown rather than built, using techniques that the Spike Fathers had shared with Sicarian scientists during their brief alliance. Its hull incorporated living rock that had been shaped by the Hulk's own hands, creating a structure that was both incredibly durable and symbolically significant as a bridge between the world that had made them and the world they were leaving behind. The departure from Sakaar was witnessed by millions of citizens who had gathered to see their liberator embark on a mission that they understood might result in his destruction. The speeches and ceremonies that marked the occasion were heavy with unspoken fears about what would become of their world if the Green King did not return, but also with recognition that some forms of justice transcended political considerations and personal safety. The journey through space aboard the stone ship provided time for reflection and planning, but it also allowed the rage that had motivated their departure to mature into something even more dangerous and implacable. The World Breaker's anger was not diminishing with time or distance, but growing stronger as he contemplated the scope of the betrayal that had been perpetrated against him and the innocent lives that had been lost as a consequence of his supposed friends' actions. The warbound who accompanied him on this mission of vengeance were motivated by their own complex mixture of loyalty, justice, and personal grievance against the civilization that had rejected and exiled their leader. Korg's philosophical nature allowed him to understand the moral dimensions of their quest, while also recognizing its potential for catastrophic consequences. Miek carried the burden of having precipitated these events through his decision to reveal the truth, while Hiroyam struggled with the spiritual implications of participating in what might become a war of extermination. The approach to Earth's solar system triggered defensive responses from monitoring stations and deep space patrol ships that had been established to protect the planet from exactly this type of threat. But the technology that Earth's defenders possessed was inadequate to stop or even significantly delay a vessel that had been constructed using techniques that combined Sicarian engineering with cosmic-level insights provided by DersDefenders.com's karmic-level insights provided by beings who had traveled between stars for millions of years. The confrontation with Black Bolt on the Moon represented the first test of the World Breaker's enhanced capabilities against opponents who possessed power levels that approached his own. The Inhuman King's voice had always been his greatest weapon, capable of generating sonic vibrations that could shatter mountains or level cities with a whispered word. But the Hulk's transformation had given him resistance to forms of attack that would have been devastating to his previous incarnations, allowing him to withstand assaults that should have been instantly fatal. The battle that followed was brief but decisive, demonstrating that the World Breaker represented a qualitative change in the threat that the Hulk posed to any opponent. Black Bolt's defeat was not just a tactical victory, but a symbolic statement about the futility of resistance against a force that had transcended normal limitations of strength and durability. The image of the Inhuman King's battered form would serve as a warning to Earth's other defenders about what they would face if they chose to oppose the returning exile. The ultimatum that was broadcast to Earth's population was carefully crafted to maximize both psychological impact and political pressure on the governments and organizations that would have to decide how to respond. The 24-hour deadline created urgency while also providing enough time for the target individuals to be located and apprehended if the authorities chose to comply with the World Breaker's demands. The threat to destroy the entire planet if his conditions were not met was delivered with the calm certainty of someone who possessed both the power and the willingness to carry out such a promise. The reaction of Earth's heroic community to this ultimatum revealed the divisions and moral complexities that had always existed beneath the surface of their apparent unity. Some argued for immediate compliance with the World Breaker's demands, recognizing that the lives of 4 individuals could not be weighed against the survival of an entire planet. Others insisted that capitulating to threats would establish precedents that would make future extortion inevitable, regardless of the immediate consequences of resistance. The 24 hours that followed were marked by frantic diplomatic activity and military preparations that demonstrated both the scope of Earth's defenses and their fundamental inadequacy against the threat they faced. Every superhero team and government agency was mobilized in an effort to find some solution that would avoid both global catastrophe and the sacrifice of the targeted individuals. But the calculations and analyses that were conducted during this period only confirmed what many had already suspected. The World Breaker possessed power that exceeded anything Earth's defenders had ever encountered. The personal struggles of the Illuminati members who had been marked for judgment added human drama to what might otherwise have been a purely tactical situation. Reed Richards threw himself into desperate scientific research aimed at finding technological solutions to their dilemma, while Tony Stark worked to coordinate defensive measures that might at least minimize the casualties if their worst fears were realized. Doctor Strange delved into mystical knowledge that might provide options unavailable through conventional means, while Black Bolt recovered from his injuries and prepared for what might be his final battle. The countdown to the World Breaker's return created an atmosphere of barely controlled panic that affected every level of society, from world leaders to ordinary citizens who could only wait and hope that somehow their heroes would find a way to protect them. The evacuation of major population centers became exercises in organized chaos, as millions of people attempted to flee from cities that might become battlefields. While emergency services struggled to maintain basic functions in the face of social breakdown, the moment of the World Breaker's arrival marked the beginning of events that would test not just Earth's defenses but the fundamental assumptions about heroism and justice that had guided human civilization throughout its history. The stone ship's landing created seismic disturbances that could be felt across continents, while the emergence of the Warbound from its hull served notice that this would be no simple confrontation between former allies, but a war between incompatible visions of what justice required. The stage was set for conflicts that would determine the fate of two worlds and the future of relationships between Earth and the broader galactic community. The World Breaker had come home not as a returning hero but as an agent of retribution whose rage had been refined by suffering and betrayal into something that might prove unstoppable by any force that Earth's defenders could bring to bear against him. The stone ship's impact with Manhattan's bedrock sent seismic shockwaves rippling through the city's foundations, transforming skyscrapers into swaying monuments to human fragility, while subway tunnels collapsed beneath the weight of geological forces that had been unleashed by the World Breaker's return. The vessel itself was unlike anything Earth's defenders had encountered, its hull composed of living rock that had been shaped by cosmic forces beyond their understanding, while its occupants emerged with the grim purpose of beings who had crossed the void between worlds seeking not conquest but justice. The 24-hour ultimatum had expired with the precision of an atomic clock, marking the moment when diplomacy gave way to the inexorable logic of vengeance that had driven the World Breaker across light years of empty space. The evacuation of New York City had proceeded with remarkable efficiency considering the scale of the operation, but millions of civilians remained within the potential blast radius of whatever confrontation was about to unfold. The heroic community's response had been swift and comprehensive, with every available defender converging on the city that had become ground zero for what might prove to be humanity's final test. Johnny Blaze had arrived in the city as the Ghost Rider, his flaming skull and supernatural motorcycle marking him as one of the few beings on Earth whose power derived from sources that transcended normal physical limitations. The spirit of vengeance that inhabited his mortal form was ancient and implacable, driven by cosmic imperatives that operated according to moral principles rather than tactical considerations. But the human consciousness that shared space with this celestial force brought its own perspective to the situation, understanding the complexities and contradictions that pure vengeance could never fully comprehend. The confrontation between the Ghost Rider and the World Breaker on the streets of Brooklyn represented a clash between two forms of supernatural justice, each operating according to its own understanding of what the universe required from those who possessed power beyond mortal limitations. Johnny's attempt to reach Bruce Banner through appeals to reason and shared understanding of inner demons fell upon ears that had been deafened by rage too profound to be reached by conventional forms of communication. The Ghost Rider's mystical abilities, formidable as they were against supernatural threats, proved inadequate against the World Breaker's enhanced physical capabilities and limitless fury. The penance stare that could reduce most beings to catatonic guilt had no effect on someone whose rage was fueled by genuine grievance rather than simple malice. While the hellfire that could burn souls, as well as flesh, met resistance from a physiology that had been transformed by forces that operated on scales comparable to those that powered the underworld itself. The building that the Ghost Rider attempted to drop on the World Breaker was reduced to rubble and debris that barely slowed the Green Giant's advance, serving only to demonstrate the futility of conventional tactics against an opponent whose strength seemed to increase with every challenge he faced. The subway system that Johnny had hoped would provide cover for his escape became a trap that left him vulnerable to retaliation from someone who had learned patience and tactical thinking during his years as a gladiator and king. The spirit of vengeance's emergence in its true form represented an escalation that transformed their confrontation from a mere physical battle into something approaching cosmic significance. The ghostly flames that erupted from Johnny's form were not merely supernatural fire, but the concentrated essence of divine judgment, carrying within them the accumulated weight of every sin that had ever been committed by conscious beings throughout the history of the universe. But even this awesome display of celestial power proved insufficient against the World Breaker's enhanced capabilities, serving only to confirm what the supernatural entity had suspected from the beginning, that the Green Giant's cause was just according to the moral laws that governed the cosmos itself. The spirit of vengeance departed not because it lacked the power to continue the fight, but because its own nature prevented it from acting against someone whose quest for justice aligned with the fundamental principles that gave it existence and purpose. Eric O'Grady's mission as Ant-Man represented a desperate attempt to find vulnerable points in an opponent whose external defenses seemed impregnable. The technology that allowed him to shrink to subatomic size while retaining human-level strength had proven effective against conventional opponents. But the World Breaker's physiology operated according to principles that defied easy categorization or exploitation. The journey through the Hulk's internal systems became a nightmarish exploration of anatomy that had been transformed by gamma radiation and cosmic forces into something that bore only superficial resemblance to normal human biology. The stomach acid that should have dissolved any foreign matter had been neutralized by energies that operated beyond the boundaries of conventional chemistry, while the cellular structures that Ant-Man encountered displayed resilience that approached the indestructible. The realization that even the World Breaker's internal organs possessed the same enhanced durability as his external form forced a fundamental reassessment of what kinds of attacks might prove effective against such an opponent. The flamethrowers that O'Grady deployed in desperation had no more effect on the stomach lining than they would have had on armor plating, while the physical trauma he attempted to inflict was healed almost instantly by regenerative processes that operated at speeds beyond human comprehension. The final escape through the nasal passages provided Eric with intelligence about the World Breaker's capabilities that would prove valuable to other defenders, but it also confirmed the worst fears of those who had hoped that some form of conventional attack might succeed where brute force had failed. The enemy they faced was not merely stronger than anything they had previously encountered, but represented a fundamental transformation in the nature of the threat that superhuman beings could pose to planetary security. The Iron Man armor that Tony Stark deployed against the World Breaker was the most advanced piece of technology that human engineering had ever produced, incorporating innovations that pushed the boundaries of materials science, energy, manipulation, and artificial intelligence. The Hulkbuster configuration had been specifically designed to counter the Hulk's known capabilities, but those specifications were based on data from previous encounters that bore little resemblance to the enhanced being who had returned from space. The battle that raged across Manhattan's skyline was as much a contest between philosophies as it was between opposing forces, with Tony's technological approach to problem-solving clashing against Bruce's raw determination to extract justice from those who had betrayed him. The repulsors and missiles that had proven effective against previous versions of the Hulk were absorbed or deflected by the World Breaker's enhanced physiology, while the armor's defensive systems were overwhelmed by attacks that generated energies beyond their design parameters. The systematic destruction of the Hulkbuster suit served as a demonstration of the futility of attempting to match the World Breaker's power through technological means alone. Each component that was torn away or crushed represented not just tactical defeat, but the failure of human ingenuity to find solutions to problems that existed beyond the realm of engineering and scientific analysis. The final confrontation between Tony and Bruce took place amid the wreckage of Avengers Tower, a structure that had symbolized the unity and purpose of Earth's mightiest heroes, but now served as a monument to the collapse of those ideals. The personal nature of their conflict was evident in every blow that was exchanged, as former friends and allies settled accounts that had been building since the moment the Illuminati had made their fateful decision to exile the Hulk. The Fantastic Four's response to the World Breaker's rampage represented both a scientific approach to an unprecedented problem and a deeply personal confrontation between individuals whose relationships had been forged through shared adventures and mutual respect. Reed Richards' guilt over his role in the Illuminati's decision was compounded by his understanding of exactly how their well-intentioned actions had been perverted into something far more sinister than they had ever intended. The force fields that Sue Storm generated to protect her family and teammates were among the most versatile defensive capabilities possessed by any hero on Earth. But they were tested to their breaking points by impacts that generated energies comparable to nuclear explosions. Her evolution from the Invisible Girl to the Invisible Woman had been marked by growing confidence in her abilities and her role within the team. But the World Breaker presented challenges that pushed even her enhanced powers beyond their normal limits. Johnny Storm's supernova-level flames represented one of the few attacks that might theoretically affect an opponent whose durability seemed absolute, but the heat and radiation that could incinerate entire city blocks barely registered against the World Breaker's transformed physiology. The Human Torch's youthful confidence in his abilities was shattered by the realization that his most powerful attacks were being treated as minor inconveniences rather than serious threats. Ben Grimm's confrontation with the World Breaker carried emotional weight that transcended their obvious physical mismatch, as the Thing attempted to reach the man he had known and respected through appeals to their shared history and friendship. But the Bruce Banner, who had once been a valued ally and confidant, had been transformed by betrayal and loss into something that bore little resemblance to the conflicted scientist who had struggled to control his other self. The intervention of the Sentry represented Earth's final hope for finding a defender whose power levels might match those of the World Breaker, but Robert Reynolds' mental instability and fear of his own capabilities made him an unreliable ally even under the best of circumstances. His reluctance to fully engage his abilities stemmed from justified concerns about the collateral damage that might result from a battle between beings whose strength operated on planetary scales. The cosmic-level confrontation that finally emerged when the Sentry abandoned his restraints transformed Manhattan into a battlefield where the laws of physics themselves seemed to break down under the strain of forces that had never been intended to interact within a planetary atmosphere. The energies released by their conflict created secondary effects that threatened to destabilize weather patterns across the entire continent, while seismic disturbances propagated through the Earth's crust with potentially catastrophic consequences for population centers thousands of miles away. The X-Men's unified response to the Worldbreaker's presence at their school represented both tactical coordination and moral courage in the face of overwhelming odds. Professor Xavier's decision to meet their former ally personally rather than hiding behind his students' protection demonstrated the kind of leadership that had made him one of the most respected figures in the superhuman community, even as it placed him in mortal danger from someone whose rage had grown beyond the reach of telepathic intervention. The battle that followed involved virtually every member of the X-Men roster, from established veterans like Wolverine and Storm to newer additions whose powers had never been tested against opponents of the Worldbreaker's caliber. The diversity of abilities that the mutant team could bring to bear created tactical opportunities that might not have been available to more conventionally organized hero groups. But even their combined efforts proved insufficient against an enemy whose strength seemed to increase with every challenge he faced. Logan's adamantium claws and healing factor had made him one of the most formidable close combat fighters in the world, but his berserker tactics were neutralized by an opponent whose durability exceeded even his legendary resilience. The psychological impact of facing someone who could shrug off attacks that would have been lethal to virtually any other opponent forced a fundamental reassessment of combat strategies that had been refined through decades of experience. The younger X-Men's attempts to contribute to the battle through teamwork and creative applications of their powers demonstrated both their courage and the inadequacy of conventional superhero training against threats that operated beyond normal parameters. Their defeat served as a harsh lesson about the limitations of even the most dedicated preparation when faced with opponents whose capabilities transcended understood boundaries. The arena that the Worldbreaker constructed in Madison Square Garden represented both a return to his gladiatorial origins and a deliberate inversion of the power relationships that had defined his enslavement on Sakaar. The obedience discs that were attached to Earth's captured heroes operated according to the same principles that had once controlled him, creating a symmetry that was both poetic and deeply disturbing in its implications for what justice might require. The forced combat between Reed Richards and Tony Stark under the Worldbreaker's direction served multiple purposes, demonstrating both the futility of resistance and the personal nature of the grievances that had motivated this campaign of vengeance. The scientific and technological approaches that had defined these men's heroic careers were rendered meaningless by circumstances that reduced them to simple gladiatorial combat for the entertainment of their former victim. The crowd's reaction to these proceedings revealed disturbing aspects of human nature that had been temporarily suppressed by the civilizing influences of law and social order. The same citizens who had once cheered for these heroes now bayed for their blood, transformed by fear and mob psychology into something that bore uncomfortable resemblance to the audiences that had once filled Sakaar's great arena. The arrival of the Sentry at the crucial moment represented both salvation and escalation, as his cosmic-level abilities finally provided Earth with a defender whose power might match the Worldbreaker's enhanced capabilities. But Robert Reynolds' mental instability made him as dangerous to the city he was trying to protect as to the enemy he had come to fight, creating a situation where victory might prove indistinguishable from defeat. The battle between the Sentry and the Worldbreaker transcended purely physical combat to become a conflict between opposing approaches to the use of ultimate power. The Sentry's abilities were matched by deep-seated fears about what he might become if he allowed himself to act without restraint. While the Worldbreaker's strength was fueled by the absolute certainty that his cause was just and that no price was too high to pay for the justice he sought. The devastation that resulted from their confrontation exceeded anything that had occurred during previous superhuman conflicts, with entire city blocks reduced to rubble and fires that burned with intensities that threatened to create their own weather patterns. The decision to evacuate the immediate area came too late to prevent massive casualties among both emergency responders and civilians who had been unable to flee quickly enough. The psychological toll on both combatants became evident as their battle continued beyond the point where either could claim strategic advantage. The sentry's enjoyment of finally being able to use his full power without restraint warred with his understanding of the destruction he was causing, while the Worldbreaker's rage began to evolve into something even more dangerous as his anger fed upon itself and grew beyond all rational bounds. The revelation of Meek's role in the destruction of Crown City provided the final catalyst that transformed the Worldbreaker from an agent of justice into something approaching a force of nature whose fury threatened the continued existence of human civilization. The knowledge that his quest for vengeance had been based on incomplete information and manipulated by one of his own trusted companions stripped away the last vestiges of rational purpose that had guided his actions. The emergence of the true Worldbreaker represented a qualitative change in the threat that Earth faced. As the geological disturbances generated by his footsteps propagated through the planet's crust with the potential to trigger seismic events that could affect every continent, the realization that his mere presence was becoming a threat to planetary stability forced authorities to consider options that had previously been unthinkable, including the use of orbital weapons systems that might destroy the threat along with everything else within a 1,000-mile radius. The final confrontation between Bruce Banner and Tony Stark took place not between the Hulk and Iron Man, but between two men who had once been friends and allies, but now found themselves on opposite sides of a conflict that neither had wanted, but both were powerless to prevent. The technological solution that Tony deployed represented both human ingenuity at its finest and the ultimate acknowledgement that some problems could only be solved through the application of overwhelming force. The satellite weapon that finally brought down the Worldbreaker operated according to principles that pushed the boundaries of what Earth science had achieved, channeling energies that had been gathered from solar radiation and focused through arrays that had taken years to construct and position. The irony that Bruce Banner was defeated by the same kind of scientific innovation that had created him in the first place was not lost on observers who understood both the poetic justice and the tragic necessity of such a resolution. The aftermath of the World War Hulk left scars on both the physical and psychological landscape of human civilization that would take generations to heal. The reconstruction of Manhattan would require technologies and resources that pushed global cooperation to unprecedented levels, while the trauma inflicted on those who had witnessed the conflict would reshape how humanity thought about its place in a universe populated by beings whose power exceeded all previous understanding. The capture and containment of Bruce Banner in his human form represented both a victory for Earth's defenders and a profound moral challenge about what justice required in the aftermath of such devastation. The man who had nearly destroyed human civilization was also a victim whose suffering had been caused by the very people who now sat in judgment over his actions, creating ethical dilemmas that had no clear solutions and would influence superhuman politics for decades to come. The silence that followed the Worldbreaker's defeat was not the peaceful quiet of resolution, but the stunned hush of a world struggling to comprehend what it had witnessed and endured. Manhattan lay in ruins, its skyline forever altered by a conflict that had pushed the boundaries of what human civilization could survive and still remain recognizably human. The emergency response teams that moved through the devastated streets worked with the mechanical efficiency of professionals who had been trained for disasters, but nothing in their experience had prepared them for destruction on this scale or complexity. Bruce Banner's unconscious form was secured with restraints that incorporated technologies borrowed from multiple sources, including Asgardian metallurgy that Thor had reluctantly provided, and mystical bindings that Doctor Strange had woven despite his injuries. The irony that it required the combined knowledge of Earth's greatest heroes to safely contain the man they had once tried to exile was not lost on those who understood the full scope of what had transpired over the past several years. The war-bound companions who had followed their king across the void between worlds found themselves facing a legal and moral system that was utterly unprepared to deal with their unique circumstances. Korg's noble bearing and obvious honor impressed those who interrogated him, but his loyalty to the World Breaker remained absolute despite the destruction that had resulted from their mission. His philosophical approach to their situation provided insights that helped human authorities begin to understand the cultural and ethical frameworks that had motivated their actions. Meek's revelation about his role in manipulating events on Sakaar had transformed him from honored companion to reviled betrayer in the eyes of both his former allies and his current captors. The insectoid's separation from his people's collective consciousness had created psychological vulnerabilities that had been exploited by those who understood how to manipulate individual desires and fears. But this understanding did little to excuse the catastrophic consequences of his deception. The nameless brood warrior's predatory nature made her perhaps the most dangerous of the captured warbound, as her species' biological imperatives remained unchanged despite her personal loyalty to Bruce Banner. Her grief over the loss of her chosen pack was genuine and profound, but it existed alongside instincts that viewed most other life forms as either prey or obstacles to be eliminated. The containment protocols developed for her required constant vigilance and multiple backup systems. Hiroim's fall from grace within the Shadow Priesthood had prepared him for imprisonment and interrogation in ways that made him uniquely resilient among the captured warbound. His understanding of Sakaarian law and custom provided valuable intelligence for those attempting to understand the broader implications of the Worldbreaker's actions, while his spiritual training offered perspectives on justice and redemption that influenced how human authorities approached the complex questions raised by their captives' presence on Earth. Elo's noble background and political sophistication made her the most valuable source of information about conditions on Sakaar and the events that had led to the current crisis. Her knowledge of imperial politics and the social forces that had shaped Sakaarian civilization provided context that helped Earth's leaders understand how their actions had set in motion events that had ultimately resulted in global catastrophe. But her testimony also revealed the depth of transformation that Bruce Banner had achieved during his years as the Green King, painting a picture of leadership and moral growth that complicated simple narratives about heroes and villains. The public reaction to the World War Hulk was complex and contradictory, reflecting deep divisions within human society about questions of justice, responsibility, and the proper role of superhuman beings in global affairs. Those who had lost loved ones or property in the devastation demanded harsh punishment for all those involved, while others argued that the real villains were the Illuminati members whose deception had created the conditions that made such tragedy inevitable. The media coverage of the conflict and its aftermath was unprecedented in its scope and intensity, with every aspect of the story analyzed and debated by experts who brought their own perspectives and agendas to their interpretations of events. The revelation that Earth's most trusted heroes had secretly conspired to exile one of their own sparked outrage that extended far beyond the immediate consequences of the Worldbreaker's rampage, raising fundamental questions about accountability and oversight in the superhuman community. The scientific analysis of the Worldbreaker's enhanced capabilities provided data that revolutionized understanding of what gamma radiation could do to human physiology under extreme circumstances. The energy levels that Bruce had generated during his transformation exceeded anything that had been previously recorded, while the planetary scale effects of his presence suggested interactions between consciousness and cosmic forces that challenged basic assumptions about the nature of reality itself. Reed Richards' role in the Illuminati's decision to exile Bruce Banner had evolved from a difficult but defensible choice into something approaching criminal negligence once the full scope of their deception became clear. His scientific reputation provided him with some protection from the more extreme demands for punishment, but the damage to his standing within the superhero community was severe and probably permanent. The guilt he carried over the consequences of his actions was compounded by his understanding of exactly how their well-intentioned plan had been perverted into attempted murder. Tony Stark's technological approach to problem-solving had always made him confident in his ability to find engineering solutions to moral and political dilemmas. But the World War Hulk had demonstrated the limitations of such thinking when applied to problems that transcended purely technical parameters. The satellite weapon that had finally brought down the World Breaker represented both the pinnacle of human technological achievement and an admission that some conflicts could only be resolved through the application of overwhelming force. Doctor Strange's mystical insights into the cosmic forces involved in Bruce's transformation had given him a deeper understanding than his colleagues possessed of exactly what they had unleashed through their actions. But this knowledge had also made him acutely aware of his own inability to control or predict the consequences of their intervention. His decision to bind himself with demonic forces during the final battle had saved lives, but it had also compromised his spiritual integrity in ways that would affect his future effectiveness as Earth's Sorcerer Supreme. Black Bolt's confrontation with the World Breaker on the Moon had demonstrated both the power and the limitations of his unique abilities, while also revealing the extent to which the Inhuman King was willing to sacrifice himself for the protection of Earth. His injuries from that battle would heal, but the psychological impact of his defeat by someone he had once considered an ally would influence his approach to future crises involving superhuman threats. The legal proceedings that followed the World War Hulk were complicated by the unprecedented nature of the crimes involved and the complex web of responsibility that extended across multiple jurisdictions and legal systems. The question of whether Earth's courts had jurisdiction over actions that had taken place on alien worlds was only one of many technical issues that had to be resolved before any meaningful prosecution could proceed. The establishment of new protocols for managing planetary-level threats represented both a necessary response to the lessons learned during the crisis and a fundamental shift in how human civilization approached its relationship with superhuman beings. The oversight mechanisms that were implemented included representatives from multiple governments and international organizations, but they also relied heavily on the cooperation of the superhuman community itself. Bruce Banner's psychological evaluation during his imprisonment revealed the profound transformation that his experiences on Sakaar had produced in his fundamental personality and worldview. The man who had once struggled with feelings of powerlessness and isolation had become someone capable of inspiring absolute loyalty and leading complex political and military campaigns. But the betrayal by his supposed friends had stripped away much of the growth and healing that he had achieved, leaving psychological wounds that might never fully close. The therapeutic approach developed for treating Bruce's condition had to account for the unique aspects of his gamma-induced mutation and the complex relationship between his human and Hulk personas. The traditional methods that had been used in previous attempts to help him manage his condition were inadequate for addressing the profound trauma and betrayal that had driven his transformation into the World Breaker. Rick Jones's survival of the final battle had been largely due to chance and the intervention of others, but his relationship with Bruce Banner provided him with unique insights into the psychological factors that had motivated the World Breaker's actions. His testimony about their friendship and his understanding of Bruce's essential nature became crucial evidence in the debates about appropriate punishment and the possibility of rehabilitation. The global infrastructure damage caused by the World War Hulk required international cooperation on a scale that had rarely been achieved even during major wars or natural disasters. The reconstruction efforts became a test of humanity's ability to work together in pursuit of common goals, while also providing opportunities for technological and social innovations that might not have been possible under normal circumstances. The economic impact of the conflict extended far beyond the immediate costs of reconstruction, as insurance markets struggled to adapt to the reality that superhuman conflicts could generate losses that exceeded the resources of entire nations. The development of new financial instruments and risk assessment methodologies became necessary for maintaining the stability of global economic systems that had never been designed to handle such extreme scenarios. The diplomatic implications of the World War Hulk affected Earth's relationships with alien civilizations that had been monitoring human development and superhuman activities. The demonstration that Earth's heroes were capable of both tremendous heroism and catastrophic errors in judgment influenced how extraterrestrial powers viewed humanity's readiness for broader participation in galactic affairs. The religious and philosophical responses to the World War Hulk were as varied as the communities that produced them, with some viewing the conflict as evidence of divine judgment, while others saw it as proof that traditional moral frameworks were inadequate for addressing the realities of a world populated by beings of godlike power. The emergence of new theological and ethical systems designed to cope with these challenges became a significant cultural development in the aftermath of the crisis. The scientific revolution that followed the analysis of world-breaker-level phenomena opened new fields of research into the relationships between consciousness, energy, and the fundamental structure of reality. The data collected during Bruce's transformation provided insights that would influence physics, biology, and psychology for generations, while also raising questions about the ultimate limits of what human science could understand or control. The educational reforms that were implemented in response to the World War Hulk focused on preparing future generations to live in a world where superhuman beings were a permanent part of the social and political landscape. The curriculum changes included not just practical training in emergency response and conflict resolution, but also philosophical and ethical instruction, designed to help young people navigate the moral complexities of a world where individuals could possess power that exceeded entire governments. The memorial services for those who had died during the conflict served multiple purposes, honoring the victims while also providing communities with opportunities to process the trauma and grief that had affected virtually everyone on the planet. The ceremonies became focal points for discussions about forgiveness, justice, and the possibility of healing relationships that had been damaged by violence and betrayal. The prisoner exchange negotiations that eventually secured the release of some of the warbound were complicated by the lack of established diplomatic relationships between Earth and Sakaar, as well as by the complex legal questions surrounding the status of beings who had committed crimes while acting under the authority of a legitimate government. The precedents established by these agreements would influence how future conflicts involving off-world entities were resolved. The technological innovations that emerged from the analysis of Sakaarian equipment and biotechnology provided Earth with capabilities that had previously existed only in theoretical models. The applications of these advances ranged from medical treatments that could heal injuries previously considered fatal to energy systems that offered alternatives to fossil fuels and nuclear power. The social changes that followed the World War Hulk were perhaps the most profound and lasting consequences of the conflict, as human civilization was forced to confront the reality that its continued survival depended on the goodwill and restraint of beings whose power exceeded its ability to control or contain. The humility that this recognition produced was accompanied by determination to build systems and institutions that could prevent similar tragedies in the future. The individual healing that Bruce Banner achieved during his imprisonment was gradual and incomplete, marked by periods of progress and regression that reflected the complexity of the psychological trauma he had endured. The support he received from unexpected sources, including some of the heroes he had fought against, provided evidence that redemption remained possible even for those who had committed acts that seemed unforgivable. The legacy of the World War Hulk extended far beyond the immediate participants and victims, influencing how subsequent generations would understand the responsibilities that came with great power and the importance of honest communication in maintaining the trust that democratic societies required. The lessons learned from this conflict would shape superhuman ethics and international relations for decades to come, serving as both warning and guide for those who would face similar challenges in the future. And so concludes the epic saga of Planet Hulk and World War Hulk, one of Marvel's most emotionally complex and morally challenging tales. This story stands as a testament to how good intentions can lead to catastrophic consequences, how betrayal can transform heroes into forces of destruction, and how the bonds forged in suffering can endure even the ultimate tests of loyalty and faith. Bruce Banner's journey from exiled victim to beloved king to instrument of vengeance reveals the profound capacity for both growth and regression that exists within every consciousness. On Sakaar, he found everything he had ever wanted: acceptance, purpose, love, and the chance to build rather than destroy. The tragedy lies not merely in the loss of these gifts, but in how that loss became the fuel for rage that nearly shattered two worlds. The Illuminati believed they were making a necessary sacrifice to protect Earth from an uncontrollable threat, but their deception created something far more dangerous than they had ever imagined. Sometimes the greatest disasters spring not from evil intentions, but from the hubris of good people who believe they can make impossible choices for others without accepting responsibility for all the consequences that might follow. The Warbound's loyalty to each other, even unto death and beyond, demonstrates that the deepest human connections transcend species, circumstances, and even moral complexity. Their brotherhood was forged in the crucible of shared suffering and tested by the ultimate challenges that power and responsibility can create. Rest now in the knowledge that even the darkest stories can illuminate truths about redemption, justice, and the unbreakable bonds that define our humanity. Sweet dreams, true believers.